Tonight, we're diving into the full story of Daemon Targaryen. This is a topic with a lot to uncover, but I'll keep my narration calm so you can still drift off to sleep. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment night 1. Now back to the video. In the long and bloody history of the Seven Kingdoms, few names evoke as much awe, terror, and fascination as that of Daemon Targaryen. He was a man of extremes, a figure carved from the very essence of dragonfire and Valyrian steel. To his enemies, he was a monster, a chaotic force of nature who thrived on conflict and cared little for the laws of gods or men. To his friends and family, he was a protector, a peerless warrior, and a man whose loyalty, though often hidden behind a mask of arrogance, ran deeper than the narrow sea. He was the Rogue Prince, a title that captures the duality of his existence. He was a prince of the blood, a grandson of the old King Jaehaerys I, yet he was always an outsider, a man who walked the thin line between greatness and madness. To understand Daemon, one must first understand the world into which he was born. The year was 81 after the conquest. The Targaryen dynasty was at the height of its power. The dragons were numerous, the realm was at peace, and the iron grip of the Dragon Lords seemed unbreakable. Yet beneath this surface of stability, the seeds of future conflict were already being sown. Daemon was the second son of Prince Balon Targaryen and Princess Alyssa Targaryen. From the moment he drew his first breath, he was surrounded by the legacy of his ancestors. He was a creature of the air and the flame. It is said that as a newborn, he was taken flying on the back of a dragon within a fortnight of his birth. This was a rare and daring feat, even for a Targaryen, and it served as a harbinger of the life he would lead. He was never a child of the earth. He belonged to the sky. As he grew, Daemon's personality began to manifest in ways that both delighted and disturbed the court at King's Landing. He was charming, possessed of that ethereal Valyrian beauty that made the common folk look upon the Targaryens as gods walking among men. He was brave to the point of recklessness, a natural athlete, and a prodigy with the blade. But he was also moody and capricious. He was a man of sudden impulses, capable of great kindness one moment and chilling cruelty the next. He did not seek the approval of the high-born lords who crowded the Red Keep. Instead, he found his solace in the dark alleys of Flea Bottom, among the thieves, the sex workers, and the outcasts of the city. He was a prince who was just as comfortable in a squalid tavern as he was in the Great Hall. This connection to the common people would later become one of his greatest political assets, but in his youth, it was seen as a sign of his instability. The defining moment of his early life came when he claimed his dragon. Every Targaryen prince and princess dreams of the bond between rider and beast, but Daemon's choice was particularly significant. He claimed Caraxes, the Blood Wyrm. Caraxes was a massive red dragon, lean and formidable, with a neck that seemed unnaturally long and a roar that could shake the foundations of a castle. The dragon had previously been ridden by Daemon's uncle, Prince Aemon, and its reputation for ferocity was well earned. When Daemon mounted Caraxes, it was as if two halves of a single soul had finally found each other. They were both lean, aggressive, and unpredictable. Together, they would become a symbol of Targaryen might that would haunt the dreams of their enemies for decades. But a prince needs more than a dragon. He needs a blade. At the age of 16, in the year 97 Vars, after the conquest, Daemon was knighted by his grandfather, King Jaehaerys. It was a day of great celebration, but the true honor came when the old king gifted him Dark Sister. This was no ordinary sword. It was one of the two legendary Valyrian steel blades brought by the Targaryens from Dragonstone, originally wielded by Queen Visenya Targaryen during the conquest. Dark Sister was designed for a woman's hand, slender, light, and terrifyingly sharp. In the hands of Daemon, it became an extension of his own will. He was the only male Targaryen of his era to be deemed worthy of the blade, and he carried it with a pride that bordered on arrogance. The sword and the dragon defined him. He was the warrior prince, the defender of the bloodline, and the man who would do what others dared not. Yet, for all his prowess, Daemon was a man constantly at odds with the structures of power. His marriage to Lady Rhea Royce of the Vale, arranged by his grandfather, was a disaster from the beginning. Daemon loathed the Vale, calling it a land of rocks and sheep, and he loathed his wife even more, famously referring to her as his bronze bitch. He spent as little time as possible in her company, preferring the heat of King's Landing or the salt air of the sea. This refusal to conform to the expectations of a royal marriage was the first of many cracks in his relationship with the crown. When his older brother, Viserys, ascended the throne, Daemon expected to be his right hand. He served as master of coin and master of laws, but his temperament was ill-suited for the slow, grinding work of governance. He found the small council tedious, and the politicking of men like Otto Hightower beneath him. Otto, the hand of the king, saw Daemon as a threat to the stability of the realm, a second son with too much ambition and too little restraint. Their rivalry would become the crucible in which the future of the Seven Kingdoms was forged. Banished from the council, Daemon took command of the city watch. It was here that he truly earned his reputation. He gave the watchmen their iconic gold cloaks, armed them with better steel, and turned a ragtag group of guards into a disciplined and feared paramilitary force. He patrolled the streets himself, dealing out brutal justice to criminals and making the city safer than it had been in years. But he also used the gold cloaks as his personal army, a force loyal to him above all others. It was during this time that he became the undisputed king of Flea Bottom, a man who knew every secret and every shadow in the capital. But the peace of King's Landing could not hold a man like Daemon for long. His hunger for glory and his desire to carve out his own kingdom led him to the Stepstones. Alongside Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake, he waged a brutal war against the Triarchy, a coalition of free cities that had seized control of the vital trade routes. This was Daemon at his most potent. He was a commander of genius, a warrior who fought in the trenches with his men, and a dragon rider who rained fire upon his enemies. When he was crowned King of the Stepstones and the Narrow Sea, it was the realization of his greatest ambition. He had made himself a king, not through inheritance but through blood and fire. However, the crown of the Stepstones was a heavy one, and Daemon's heart always remained tied to the Red Keep and to his family. His relationship with his brother Viserys was a tempestuous cycle of banishment and reconciliation. He was a man who craved his brother's love but could not help but provoke his anger. And then there was Rhaenyra, his niece, the realm's delight, and the woman who would become the center of his world. Their bond was complex, born of shared blood and a shared sense of destiny. When they eventually married, it was a union that scandalized the realm and solidified the division of the royal house. The Dance of the Dragons, the catastrophic civil war that followed the death of King Viserys, was the final act in Daemon's long and storied life. He was the soul of the Black faction, the military mind that directed Rhaenyra's forces. He was ruthless, calculating, and utterly devoted to her cause. He saw the war not just as a fight for the throne, but as a fight for the very soul of the Targaryen dynasty. He knew that the dragons were the source of their power, and he was prepared to spend them all to ensure that Rhaenyra's claim was upheld. As we look back at the life of Daemon Targaryen, we are left with a series of questions that history has never fully answered. Was he a man who truly loved his family, or was he merely a man who loved the power they represented? Did he seek the throne for himself, or was he content to be the power behind it? And what of his end? The battle above the God's Eye is one of the most legendary confrontations in the history of Westeros. A duel between two dragon riders, uncle and nephew, Daemon and Aemond, that ended in a plummet into the dark waters of the lake. Some say he died in the crash, his body lost to the depths. Others whisper that he survived, that he wandered the world as a nameless man, finally free of the burdens of his name. The mystery of Daemon Targaryen is the mystery of the Targaryens themselves. They are a family of fire and blood, of light and shadow. Daemon embodied both the best and the worst of his lineage. He was a man who could lead an army to victory, and a man who could break a heart with a single word. He was a king who wore no crown, a knight who followed no code but his own, and a dragon rider who was as fierce as the beast he rode. His legacy is written in the ruins of the Stepstones, in the songs of the Gold Cloaks, and in the bloodline of the kings who followed him. For though he died before the war was won, it was his sons who would eventually sit upon the Iron Throne, ensuring that the rogue prince would have the last laugh over his enemies. Tonight, we will trace the path of this extraordinary man. We will walk the walls of the Red Keep and the beaches of Bloodstone. We will witness the rise of the Gold Cloaks and the fall of the dragons. We will explore the marriages that shaped the realm and the betrayals that tore it apart. We will look into the eyes of Caraxes and feel the weight of Dark Sister. This is the story of a man who refused to be forgotten, a man who lived his life at the speed of a dragon's flight. This is the full story of Daemon Targaryen, the rogue prince, the king of the Stepstones, and the heart of the Dance of the Dragons. The stakes could not be higher. This is not just a biography, it is the chronicle of the end of an era. The decisions Daemon made, the battles he fought, and the children he fathered would change the course of history forever. Without him, the Targaryen dynasty might have faded into obscurity much sooner. With him, it burned with a brilliance that was both beautiful and terrifying. We must ask ourselves what it means to be a hero in a world of monsters, and whether a man can ever truly escape the shadows of his own nature. As the dragons take to the sky and the steel begins to clash, we invite you to join us on this journey through the life of one of history's most compelling figures. Let the fires be lit, let the stories be told, and let the rogue prince fly once more. Daemon Targaryen was born in the 81st year after the conquest, the second son of a king, and from the moment of his first breath, he seemed destined to walk a path of fire and shadow. In the great tapestry of Targaryen history, no figure has stirred more passion, more hatred, or more fierce devotion. He is the most polarizing figure ever to wear the dragon sigil, a man whose name is whispered in both admiration and horror across every corner of Westeros. To understand Daemon is to embrace contradiction. He was a prince of the blood, yet he spent his nights in the brothels of Flea, rubbing shoulders with thieves and cutthroats. He was a knight, gifted the legendary Valyrian steel blade Dark Sister, yet he was capable of cruelty that would make even the most hardened sellsword flinch. He was a brother who loved and resented in equal measure, a husband who sought power through marriage, yet remained fiercely loyal to those he truly cherished. This is the duality of Daemon Targaryen, a man made of equal parts light and darkness, whose choices would ignite a civil war that tore the realm apart. Tonight, we are setting the stage for a 4.5-hour deep dive into the blood and fire of his life. Every battle, every betrayal, every whispered rumor and recorded fact will be laid bare. But first, we must begin at the beginning. He was born to King Jaehaerys, the old king and queen, Alyssa Velaryon, a child who entered the world with the scent of dragon smoke already clinging to his skin. Within a fortnight of his birth, he was taken to the dragon pit and placed upon the back of a dragon, an ancient Targaryen tradition that bonded the youngest princes to the great beasts. For Daemon, this bond would be with Caraxes, the Blood Wyrm, a serpentine fury of red scales and savage temper. Caraxes had once been ridden by his uncle, Prince Aemon, and the dragon seemed to recognize in young Daemon a kindred spirit, wild, unpredictable, and hungry for glory. As a boy, Daemon was charming and brave, quick with a smile, and quicker with a sword. He was knighted at 16 by his grandfather, King Jaehaerys himself, and in the same ceremony, he received Dark Sister, the blade of Queen Visenya. It was a weapon suited to a warrior of swift and deadly grace, and Daemon would wield it with unmatched skill for the rest of his days. Yet even then, there was something unsettled about him, a restlessness that could not be tamed by ceremony or duty. His first marriage, arranged by the old king, was to Lady Rhea Royce of Runestone. For Daemon, it was a gilded cage. He despised her, calling her his bronze bitch, and spent most of his time away from her lands, seeking adventure and trouble in King's Landing. He wanted the marriage annulled, but his older brother, King Viserys, refused with a simple, blunt word: nope. That refusal would fester, driving a wedge between the brothers that would never fully heal. And it is there, in that rift, that we begin to see the shape of the man. Daemon was not content to be a prince of the court, a mere ornament at his brother's side. He craved power, yes, but more than that, he craved recognition. He wanted to be seen as something more than the spare heir, the rogue prince who could not be controlled. In the years to come, he would find that recognition on the battlefield, in the arms of a forbidden love, and in the flames of a dragon's fury. But before we witness his rise to the Stepstones, before the dance of the dragons, before the blood and fire that would define his legacy, we must first understand the world that shaped him. The reign of the old king, Jaehaerys the Conciliator, was a time of peace and prosperity. But beneath the surface, the seeds of conflict were already being sown. Daemon was not merely a product of his own choices. He was a mirror, reflecting the tensions of his age. In the next chapter, we will turn back the clock to examine the blood of the old king, the dynasty that gave Daemon his name and his dragon, and the impossible expectations that were placed upon him from the moment he was born. What does it mean to be a Targaryen prince in the shadow of a legend? How does a second son find his place when the throne is already claimed? Those questions will lead us deep into a story of ambition, betrayal, and the terrible cost of greatness. For now, let Daemon's enigma settle around you, like the low hum of a dragon's purr. The fire is just beginning to glow. In the 81st year after the conquest, a child was born in the Red Keep who would one day embody that very tension between light and darkness more completely than any Targaryen before him. His name was Daemon, the second son of Prince Balon and Princess Alyssa, and from the moment he drew his first breath, he was caught in the long shadow of a king who had already reigned for over 3 decades. That king was Jaehaerys I, the Old King, the Conciliator, a man who had turned a dynasty of conquerors into a stable, unchallenged ruling house. And it was within that shadow, under that immense weight of expectation and legacy, that Daemon's restless spirit began to stir. To understand Daemon, you must first understand the world that received him. The year 81 AC was a time of peace and prosperity in the Seven Kingdoms. Jaehaerys had spent his reign building roads, codifying laws, binding the great houses to the Iron Throne, through marriage and diplomacy. The dragons still flew in numbers, but they were no longer instruments of war. They were symbols, living monuments to a power that had become almost ceremonial. The Targaryen name was sacred, but it was also heavy. Every prince and princess born into that line carried the memory of Aegon the Conqueror, of Maegor the Cruel, of Aenys the Weak. They were expected to be worthy of that blood, and Daemon, as the younger son of the heir apparent, Prince Balon, was born into a role that seemed safe, predictable, and utterly unremarkable, a spare to a spare, third in line behind his older brother Viserys. But the blood of the old king was not a calm river. It was a torrent of ambition, pride, and fire, and Daemon had inherited more than his fair share. His father Balon was a warrior, a dragon rider, a man who had earned the nickname the Spring Prince for his vigor and courage. His mother Alyssa was no less fierce, a Targaryen through and through, known for her wild spirit and her love of flying. She took Daemon into the sky on Dragonback when he was barely a fortnight old, a custom reserved for the most robust of Targaryen infants. That early bond with the wind and the height and the raw power of a dragon may have planted the first seed of his lifelong hunger for freedom and dominion. He was not content to remain on the ground, not even as a babe in arms. As he grew, the Red Keep became both his playground and his cage. The corridors of that ancient fortress echoed with the whispers of history. Every stone had been laid by a dragon lord. Every tapestry depicted a conquest or a tragedy. Daemon walked those halls as a boy, but he could feel the weight of them pressing against his chest. He was surrounded by cousins and siblings who seemed to accept their fates with grace. Viserys, his elder brother, was dutiful, steady, and utterly predictable, the perfect heir. Their sisters Dalla and Alysanne were gentle, proper, and destined for political marriages. But Daemon, he chafed. He sought out the company of squires and servants rather than lords and maesters. He wandered into the city of King's Landing, down into the squalor of Flea Bottom, where the small folk lived and died far from the gilded council chambers. It was not mere rebellion. It was a desperate need to see what lay beyond the gilded walls of his birthright. Even in his earliest years, the signs were unmistakable. He was clever with a blade, quick to anger, quicker to laugh. He could charm a lady or a whore with equal ease, and he could insult a lord or a king with the same effortless arrogance. The old king, his grandfather, watched him with a mixture of pride and concern. Jaehaerys had seen too many Targaryens burn out too fast. Aegon the Uncrowned, Maegor, Rhaena, the list went on. He had worked his entire life to build a stable dynasty, and here was a boy with fire in his veins, and no natural channel for it. The king tried to guide him, to teach him patience and duty, but the lessons never seemed to take root. Daemon respected his grandfather, perhaps even loved him, but he could not imitate him. He was not built for peace, and so the seed of the rogue prince was planted, not in defiance, but in the very soil of his birth. The old king's shadow was meant to protect and nurture, but for Daemon it became a shadow that he would spend his entire life trying to step out of. He would never fully succeed. The weight of the Targaryen legacy would cling to him like smoke, no matter how far he flew. But he would try, again and again, with each dragon ride, each sword stroke, each bold and reckless decision. That restless ambition, that refusal to be merely a prince, would define every step of his journey. And the first major step would come not in the courtroom or the council chamber, but in the skies above Dragonstone, where a dragon awaited him, a dragon that matched his own wild, untamed nature in ways that would change everything. Only a few years after his birth, the weight of the Targaryen legacy began to press upon young Daemon in ways that no crown or ceremony could measure. For a prince of the blood, the true test of worth was not the political machinations of court, but the ancient, firelit bond with a dragon. And no dragon in all of Westeros inspired both terror and awe, quite like the beast that would become Daemon's lifelong shadow, Caraxes, the Blood Wyrm. The story of Caraxes begins long before Daemon ever laid eyes on him. This dragon was no hatchling plucked from a clutch of eggs. He was a seasoned, battle-scarred creature of immense size and temperament, already infamous across the Seven Kingdoms. His previous rider had been none other than Prince Daemon Targaryen, the younger brother of King Jaehaerys I, and a man of considerable renown in his own right. Daemon had claimed Caraxes in his youth, and together they had flown through decades of service to the crown, participating in the suppression of various rebellions, and even journeying to the frozen lands beyond the Wall. It was said that Caraxes was the most aggressive dragon of his generation, a serrated terror with a long, slender neck and a body the color of freshly spilled blood. When Daemon finally perished in a skirmish against pirates in the Stepstones, Caraxes returned to Dragonstone alone, his grief making him even more volatile. The dragon was left riderless, a living weapon waiting for a hand that could match his fury, and that hand belonged to a boy, barely old enough to understand the word caution. Daemon Targaryen, still in the early years of his youth, felt an inexplicable pull toward the ancient Wyrm, while other children of the royal blood might have trembled at the sight of Caraxes' crimson scales, or the low, guttural hiss that rumbled from his throat. Daemon felt something else entirely. He felt recognition. The fateful encounter between young Daemon and the dragon Caraxes is not recorded in any maester's chronicle with precise detail, but the whispers that survive paint a picture of pure, unspoken affinity. It is said that Daemon walked alone into the cavernous lair beneath the Dragonmont, the volcanic heart of Dragonstone. No handlers, no seasoned dragon keepers, no iron chains or meat offerings. He simply entered the darkness and emerged hours later, with Caraxes following him like a faithful hound. How did he do it? No one knows, but those who witnessed it insisted that the dragon did not so much submit as choose. Caraxes lowered his long, serpentine neck, and Daemon placed a hand on the beast's snout. In that single gesture, a pact was sealed, not of master and servant, but of two creatures who understood each other's fire. This was not a tame dragon, and Daemon was not a tame prince. Caraxes' ferocity was legendary, and it did not diminish under his new rider. It was amplified. The Blood Wyrm and the rogue prince became a single entity in the skies. Where other dragon riders commanded their mounts with careful signals and measured control, Daemon and Caraxes seemed to move as one mind, one will. The dragon's aggression, his tendency to strike first and ask questions later, mirrored Daemon's own impulsive, mercurial nature. In combat, Caraxes would lash out with a violence that other dragons reserved for desperate moments, and Daemon would push him further, relishing the chaos they created together. The world learned to fear the pairing, a prince with no patience for politics, and a dragon with no patience for anything at all. But there was more to this bond than brute strength. It was an amplification of Daemon's very soul. Every flicker of anger, every surge of ambition, every flash of cruelty or charm, Caraxes felt it and responded in kind. When Daemon was restless, Caraxes would stir in his lair, smoke curling from his nostrils. When Daemon was elated, Caraxes would take to the sky in a spiral of crimson wings. And when Daemon was wounded, emotionally or physically, the dragon would growl low and long, a sound that promised vengeance. This was not a partnership, it was a mirror, and that mirror would reflect Daemon's darkest impulses back at him, propelling him toward destinies that no other prince could have dreamed of. From the moment Daemon claimed Caraxes, he was no longer just a younger son of the royal house. He was the rider of the Blood Wyrm, a force of nature in his own right, and that identity would carry him through every triumph and every disaster that lay ahead. But power must be forged, not just inherited. The next step in Daemon's transformation would come not from dragonfire, but from ancient steel, a blade that had once belonged to a warrior queen, a weapon that would fit his hand as perfectly as Caraxes fit his soul, and its name was Dark Sister. The dragon Caraxes had accepted him, a bond forged in fire and blood that would shape the rest of his life. But a Targaryen prince, especially one as restless as Daemon, could not rest solely on the back of a dragon. The realm expected more: knighthood, honor, a sword in hand as well as a whip. And in the 97th year after the conquest, when Daemon was 16, that expectation became a ceremony. King Jaehaerys the Conciliator, his grandfather, performed the rite. The old king had seen countless knights made, but this was different. Daemon was not just any grandson. He was the son of Prince Balon, the Spring Prince, and the blood of Aegon the Conqueror ran hot in his veins. As Daemon knelt in the royal sept of the Red Keep, the weight of his family's legacy pressed down on him. Yet those who watched noted how still he remained, how his eyes did not waver. He had trained since he could hold a wooden sword, drilling in the yard against men twice his age. And now the realm would see what he had become. The king touched his shoulders with the blade, reciting the vows. Daemon rose a knight, but Jaehaerys was not finished. From a velvet-lined chest, he drew forth a sword that seemed to drink the light from the room. Its blade was dark as smoke, rippled with the telltale patterns of Valyrian steel, and its hilt was simple but elegant, designed for a hand that favoured speed over brute force. This was Dark Sister, the blade of Queen Visenya Targaryen, the warrior queen who had ridden Vargar and helped conquer the Seven Kingdoms. She had wielded it to cut down her enemies, to enforce her brother's will, and to forge a dynasty. Now it passed to Daemon. The significance was not lost on anyone present. Dark Sister had not been given to a man in generations. It had been kept in the armory, a relic of a fiercer age, waiting for a wielder who embodied its spirit. Daemon was that wielder. He was not yet a warrior of legend. That would come. But in that moment, the crown declared him the heir to the Targaryen martial tradition. The warrior's mantle, once worn by Visenya and later by Prince Aemon, now settled on Daemon's shoulders. He accepted the blade, felt its balance, and for the first time, understood what it meant to carry a piece of his ancestors into battle. This was more than a gift. It was a statement. Daemon Targaryen was being recognized for his prowess, his potential to be the sword of House Targaryen, and he lived up to that promise. In the years that followed, he would carve a legend with that very blade. From the tawny grounds of King's Landing to the blood-soaked sands of the Stepstones. But before any of that, there was another matter. An arrangement made by the old king to tie Daemon to the great houses. A marriage. And that marriage would become the source of his deepest scorn. A chain he would try to shatter for more than a decade. It was to a woman of the Vale, a lady of House Royce, and Daemon would learn that some bonds are harder to break than steel. The story of that union, and its bitter end, waits for us in the next chapter. Dark Sister was not a mere weapon, it was a declaration. When King Jaehaerys I placed that blade in Daemon's hands at his knighthood in 97 AC. He was affirming something the young prince already knew in his bones. He was born for war, but the old king was also a master of political chess, and he understood that a sword without a sheath could cut the hand that wielded it. So alongside the Valyrian steel, Jaehaerys offered Daemon something far less glamorous, a wife. And not just any wife, Lady Rhea Royce of Runestone, the heir to one of the most ancient houses in the Vale. The arrangement was sealed in the same year, 97 AC, and it was intended to bind the Targaryen dynasty to the stubborn, rocky heart of the Vale. The Royces had held Runestone since the Age of Heroes, their bronze armour and rune-etched shields a living link to the first men. For a king who prized stability above all else, it was a sensible match. But for Daemon, it was a cage wrapped in silk. From the moment he laid eyes on the Vale, he made his contempt unmistakable. He called it the Plain of the Vale, a deliberate slight against the mountainous, jagged landscape that the Vale lords proudly called home. To Daemon, everything about it was dull and provincial. The grey skies, the clinging mist, the endless drone of shepherds and merchants who had never seen the glory of King's Landing. And then there was Rhea herself. She was a woman of the Vale to a core, practical, stoic, and utterly unimpressed by the Dragon Prince's swagger. She did not simper or swoon. She wore bronze armour as naturally as he wore black leather, and she managed her lands with a competence that grated on Daemon's sense of superiority. He did not hide his disdain. In the halls of Runestone, he spoke openly of his marriage as a punishment, a dull exile from the court he craved. He referred to his wife not by name but by her house's sigil, calling her his bronze bitch, with a venom that shocked even the most hardened Vale lords. And when he was away from her, which was most of the time, he spent his days dragon riding over the peaks of the Mountains of the Moon, or brooding in the castle's cold chambers. Dreaming of the Iron Throne, he felt, was his birthright. The political failure of the Union was inevitable. A marriage needs two people willing to build something, and Daemon was determined to tear it down. He refused to produce an heir, a deliberate act of sabotage that left the Royce succession in limbo. Rhea needed a child to secure her claim, and Daemon needed that child about as much as he needed another boot. He argued that he had been forced into the match, that his blood should not be diluted by bronze when it could be mingled with dragons, and so he returned again and again to the King's Landing court, leaving Rhea to manage Runestone alone, a ghost wife in a cold castle. He petitioned Jaehaerys for an annulment, and when that failed, he turned to his brother Viserys after the old king's death. Each time the answer was the same: no. Daemon could not break the bonds of duty with a dragon's roar or a sword's edge. That frustration, that simmering resentment, would colour his every move in the years to come. It drove him back to the capital, back to the corridors of power, where he could at least pretend to matter. And it was there, in the shadow of the Red Keep, that King Viserys the Feist made a decision designed to both contain and distract his restless brother. He offered Daemon a new role, one that would keep him busy and hopefully out of trouble. It was an appointment that would place the Prince of the City Watch at the head of the Gold Cloaks, and later, in a strange twist, give him authority over the very coin that had once eluded him. But that is a story for another telling, a story of law and ledger, of brothels and betrayal, and of the first sparks that would eventually ignite the dance of the dragons. The marriage to Lady Rhea Royce was a cage, and Daemon Targaryen was a creature not meant for captivity. By the time King Shris I ascended the Iron Throne in 103 after the conquest, Daemon had spent years chafing against the bonds of a union he never wanted. His brother, now king, understood the danger of a restless dragon with nothing to burn. So Viserys extended a hand, not with affection, but with a careful, calculated hope that responsibility might tame the rogue prince. He offered Daemon a seat on the small council. It was a gesture of trust, or perhaps a desperate attempt to keep his brother within the walls of King's Landing, where he could be watched. Daemon accepted. He had no better offer, The title of Master of Coin was not one he sought, but it came with power, or at least the illusion of it, and Daemon, ever hungry for recognition, took the position with a wry smile that promised trouble. For a few weeks, he performed his duties with a flicker of diligence. He reviewed ledgers, attended meetings, and sat through interminable discussions of tariffs and tax reforms. But the tedium of administration was a slow poison to a man who thrived on chaos and swordplay. The numbers blurred before his eyes. The endless debates over grain shipments and silver coinage felt like drudgery dressed up as governance. Daemon's attention wandered to the window, to the sky beyond where Caraxes circled, to the streets below where real life pulsed, without the stifling decorum of the Red Keep. It was not long before Daemon began to treat the treasury as his personal chest. His unorthodox financial methods became the stuff of whispered scandal. He redirected funds intended for the Watch towards his own projects, levied taxes on the brothels of Flea Bottom with the casual cruelty of a man who saw coin as a toy, and drafted decrees that favoured his own allies over the crown's interests. He treated the realm's gold as if it were his own inheritance, and in a sense, he believed it was. The small council chambers grew cold. Otto Hightower, the hand of the king, watched Daemon with the unblinking patience of a spider sensing a fly. Otto was a man of order, of protocol, of careful ambition. He saw in Daemon not a prince, but a threat, a wild card that could unravel decades of Hightower influence over the throne. Every misstep Daemon made, Otto recorded. Every reckless expenditure, every sharp word muttered in council became evidence in a case slowly building against the rogue prince. The friction between them escalated with each passing week. Daemon mocked Otto's solemnity, dismissed his counsel, and once, in a moment of public defiance, suggested that the hand would be better suited to sewing silks than managing a kingdom. Otto's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He did not need to speak. He had the king's ear, and Viserys, for all his love of his brother, was not blind to Daemon's antics. The Master of Coin's tenure grew shorter by the day. Viserys, hoping to redirect his brother's energy, shifted Daemon to the role of Master of Laws. It was a move designed to channel Daemon's aggression into something constructive, or at least to keep him occupied. But the law, like finance, required patience and precision. Daemon had neither. He rewrote statutes to suit his whims, dismissed cases with a wave of his hand, and spent more time in the taverns of the Street of Silk than in his chambers. The council grew weary. Otto Hightower began to whisper to the king in private. He spoke of Daemon's untrustworthiness, his disdain for duty, his potential to become a rallying point for dissent. Viserys listened, torn between brotherly affection and the weight of his crown. The experiment of integrating Daemon into the small council was failing. The rogue prince was not meant for ledgers and legal codes. He was meant for battle, for chaos, for fire. And the city of King's Landing, with its narrow streets and its hidden dangers, offered another path. One that would soon make Daemon a different kind of power entirely. The gold cloaks waited, patient as wolves, for a lord who understood the language of the street. By the time Daemon Targaryen walked away from the small council, he had already proven to everyone that he was not a man suited to ledgers and petitions. His brief tenure as Master of Coin had been a disaster of creative accounting and outright mockery. He had drained the treasury for tourneys and feasts, and when the hand of the king, Otto Hightower, tried to rein him in, Daemon simply resigned with a smirk. He did the same as Master of Laws after only 6 months. The message was clear. Daemon Targaryen would not be tamed by a chair and a quill, so King Viserys, his older brother, desperate to keep him close and out of real trouble, offered him something else. In the year 103 after the conquest, Viserys appointed Daemon as commander of the city watch of King's Landing. At first glance it seemed a strange gift. The city watch was a ragtag force of men who wore mismatched armour, carried rusty weapons, and spent more time shaking down merchants than keeping the peace. They were a joke, a symbol of the rot that had festered in the capital for decades. But Daemon saw what others did not. Here was an army without a lord, a weapon waiting to be forged. He threw himself into the task with the same ferocity he had shown when he first climbed onto Caraxes. Within a fortnight, the Watch was unrecognizable. Daemon drilled them from dawn until dusk. He dismissed the old captains who had profited from corruption and replaced them with men who feared him more than they loved gold. He demanded discipline, loyalty, and above all fear, and he gave them a uniform. He ordered every man to wear a heavy cloak of golden cloth, dyed with the finest saffron and trimmed with black. The gold cloaks became their identity, their badge of terror. No longer a laughingstock, the city watch under Daemon was a machine of brutal efficiency. They swept through Flea Bottom, dragging thieves and murderers from their dens. They cracked down on the gangs that had ruled the alleys for years. They did not bargain, they broke bones. Daemon rode with them on patrols, his shadow stretching long under the torchlight, Caraxes circling above like a blood-red omen. King's Landing had not seen such a cleansing in living memory. The streets grew quieter, the merchants safer, and the cost was paid in blood. Daemon called it order. The small folk called it the reign of the gold cloaks, but there was a darker purpose beneath the shine. Daemon did not just clean the city, he made the watch his own. Every man swore loyalty to him, not the crown. They became his eyes and ears in every brothel and hovel. And in Flea Bottom, he found something more valuable than men. He found Mysaria, a dancer from Lys, pale as milk, sharp as a blade. She became his lover, his confidant, his spy. Together, they turned the gold cloaks into a private intelligence network. Daemon now knew every whisper in the Red Keep, every secret of the small council. His brother had given him the keys to the city, and Daemon was building a kingdom from the shadows. The hand of the king, Otto Hightower, watched with growing alarm. He had hoped to exile Daemon with a meaningless title. Instead, he had armed the wolf. When the year turned, Daemon's grip on King's Landing was absolute. The gold cloaks answered to no one but him. They marched through the streets in perfect formation, their cloaks blazing like captured sunlight. Criminals fled or died. The city was cleaner, leaner, and more afraid than it had been in decades. Daemon at last had found a role that suited him. Not a master of coin, not a master of laws, but a master of men. And yet even this would not be enough. For Daemon Targaryen, the leash was still a leash, no matter how golden. He began to look beyond the walls of the capital, toward the narrow sea, toward war and glory. But before that, he would become something else. A prince not of the Red Keep, but of the gutters and the alleys, the true lord of Flea Bottom. By the time Daemon Targaryen took command of the City Watch in 103 AC, he had already tasted the small council's boredom and found it wanting. But the gold cloaks were different. Here was a force he could shape with his own hands. 7,000 men who answered to him, not to the lords of the Red Keep. And yet, even as he drilled them into a disciplined, feared military presence on the streets of King's Landing, Daemon's attention began to wander toward a darker, more intoxicating corner of the city. He was not content to merely patrol the surface. He wanted to know the veins beneath the stone. So began Daemon's immersion into the underworld of the capital's poorest district, a place where the cobblestones were slick with offal, and the only law was the one you made yourself, Flea Bottom. Its name alone conjured a stench, but for the prince it smelled like opportunity. He did not ride Caraxes into those narrow alleys. Instead, he walked among the small folk, trading his velvet for wool and his silver tongue for the rough currency of shared ale. He sat in the same taverns where thieves planned their scores, where cutthroats argued over territory, and where the desperate sold everything they had for a single hot meal. He listened, and he was heard. The forging of a private network of spies, cutthroats and informants did not happen overnight. It required patience, a virtue Daemon rarely displayed, but one he could summon when the game was worth it. He cultivated informants who could read the lips of merchants, bribed brothel keepers who overheard the whispers of lords, and won the loyalty of former sellswords who had nowhere else to go. The key was not gold alone, though he had plenty of that. It was reputation. He paid well. He kept secrets. And when a spy was caught, Daemon did not abandon them. He silenced the threat himself, often with a single shadowed stroke of Dark Sister. Word spread through Flea Bottom like fire through dry kindling. The Dragon Prince was not like the others. He did not look down his nose at the poor. He did not flinch at the sight of a whore's bruises or a beggar's sores. He walked among them, spoke their tongue, and sometimes, just sometimes, he stepped in on their behalf. A landlord squeezing too hard, Daemon would visit him in the night. A city guard beating a fishwife for no cause, Daemon would have that guard reassigned to the farthest gate. Or worse, his growing reputation as a hero to the small folk and a menace to the lords became a dual-edged weapon. The common people began to trust him, even love him. The powerful began to fear him. Otto Hightower watched this transformation with growing unease. In the Red Keep, the hand of the king warned Viserys that Daemon was building a shadow army, that his influence in Flea Bottom was a cancer on the city's governance. But Viserys, ever eager to avoid conflict, did not act. He saw only a brother finding purpose, not a rogue prince sharpening his blade in the dark. And so Daemon continued to weave his web, thread by thread, until the underworld of King's Landing answered to him more truly than it answered to the Iron Throne. Mysaria, the White Dancer from Lys, became his closest ally in this enterprise. She knew every backroom and blind alley, every madam and moneylender. Through her, Daemon's network reached into the very walls of the Great Sept and the chambers of the small councils itself. He learned which lord was gambling his keep, which knight was sleeping with his squire, which merchant was defrauding the crown. Some of this knowledge he used, some he hoarded, a silent threat waiting for the right moment. But for all his cunning, Daemon could not control everything. The small folk who adored him were also the first to suffer when his machinations went awry. A raid gone wrong, a feud between criminal gangs that spilled into the streets. The prince's shadow games had real consequences, and the bodies that piled up were never his own. He accepted this calculus without remorse. To him, the people were both his army and his shield. He protected them because they protected him. By the end of 104 AC, Daemon's reputation had become a paradox. In the taverns of Flea Bottom, men raised their cups to the prince of the city, the man who brought order to chaos. In the solar of the Red Keep, lords muttered curses and called him a destabilizing force. Daemon himself seemed to relish the contradiction. He was the rogue prince, the Lord of the Lost, the king who wore no crown, but held the keys to every locked door in King's Landing. Yet one door remained closed to him, the throne, and the heir that stood between him, and it was not a dwarf or a fool, but a girl, his niece, Rhaenyra Targaryen. Daemon watched her grow, watched her ride Syrax, watched her charm the court, and he began to calculate. If he could not be king, perhaps he could be the power behind the queen. But first, he needed to ensure that the small folk who cheered him now would remember his name when the time came to choose a side. That game was just beginning, and it would lead him to the darkest event of his early life, an event the histories would call the Heir for a day. By the time Daemon had fully embedded himself into the underbelly of Flea Bottom, he had become a creature of two worlds. By day, he was the commander of the Gold Cloaks, a prince of the blood and the brother of the king. By night, he was a patron of the cheapest ale, the most dangerous games, and the company of women who sold their touch for a few coppers. He had built a network of whispers that stretched from the gutters to the Red Keep's own kitchens, and he knew the city's pulse better than any maester's raven could carry. But no amount of intelligence could prepare anyone for what was about to break the realm. In the 105th year after Aegon's conquest, Queen Aemma Arryn was heavy with child. King Viserys of us had long hoped for a son, a male heir to secure the Targaryen dynasty. Daemon, as the king's younger brother, stood as the presumptive heir, but that position was always precarious. Viserys wanted a son, and the realm expected one. Queen Aemma had already suffered several miscarriages, and each loss carved deeper lines into the king's face. When she finally went into labour in the early spring of 105, the entire court held its breath. The birth was brutal. The child, a boy, came into the world only by the most desperate of measures. The maesters, led by the Archmaester of the Citadel, cut the queen open to free the babe. It was a procedure that saved the child at the cost of the mother. Amma Arryn died screaming on the birthing bed, her blood soaking the sheets of Maegor's holdfast, and the infant prince, named Balon after Viserys' own father, lived barely a single day. His lungs were too weak, his body too small, and by the time the sun set on that terrible night, both mother and child were gone. The realm mourned. Viserys was inconsolable. He had lost his wife and his son in one stroke, and the crown felt heavier than ever before. But in the days that followed, something else began to stir. Daemon, still the heir presumptive, found himself in a position that was at once enviable and dangerous. He was once again the next in line for the Iron Throne, but the way he chose to celebrate that fact would forever stain his name. A few days after the funeral, Daemon retreated to his familiar haunts in Flea Bottom. A brothel known as the Street of Silk housed a particularly rowdy tavern in its back rooms, and there Daemon gathered with his closest confidants, Goldcloak officers, sellswords, and the enigmatic dancer Mysaria, whom he had taken as a lover. The wine flowed freely, and the mood was dark and raucous. It was in that haze of drink and debauchery that Daemon raised his cup and made a toast. He called out, loud enough for the whole room to hear, a toast to the heir for a day. The words hung in the smoky air. He meant them as a joke, a sardonic nod to his own nephew, who had lived only a single day, and to his own renewed position. But the toast was heard by more than just his drinking companions. It was whispered, carried by spies and servants, and within a fortnight, it reached the ears of King Viserys. The king's reaction was volcanic. This was not merely a poor jest. It was a public mockery of a dead child and a dead queen. Viserys saw it as proof that Daemon had no respect for the crown, for family, or for the sacred bonds of blood. The king summoned Daemon to the throne room. There, before the assembled court, Viserys stripped his brother of his position as commander of the City Watch. He also banished Daemon from King's Landing, ordering him to return to his wife, Lady Rhea Royce in the Vale. A punishment Daemon considered far worse than exile, but Viserys was not finished. He had made a decision that would reshape the future of the Seven Kingdoms. He would not name Daemon as his heir. Instead, he would name his daughter, Rhaenyra Targaryen, a girl of 8 years, as the Princess of Dragonstone and the rightful successor to the Iron Throne. In one stroke, Viserys defied centuries of tradition. No woman had ever sat the Iron Throne, and many lords would argue that none should. But Viserys was determined to prevent Daemon from ever holding power. He forced every lord and lady in the realm to swear oaths of fealty to Rhaenyra. It was a fragile solution, built on loyalty and fear, but it was the only stone the king could throw at the tide of ambition. Daemon, exiled and furious, rode Caraxes out of the capital, but he did not go to the Vale. He went to Dragonstone, the ancient seat of his house, and there he brooded. He had lost everything in a single night: his command, his status, and his place in the succession, and all because of a drunken toast in a Flea Bottom brothel. But Daemon was not finished. He was the blood of the dragon, and dragons do not surrender. As he watched the black stone of Dragonstone's fortress rise against the sea, he began to plan his next move, and in the shadows of the capital, a figure was already moving to help him. A woman known only as the White Worm, whose influence was about to become far more dangerous than any toast. The celebration that night in Flea Bottom was loud, raw, and dangerous. Daemon had drunk deeply, his laughter cutting through the smoke and sweat of the brothel, and when he raised his goblet to toast the dead infant prince, the son Viserys had waited years for, he didn't just mock his brother, he broke something between them that could never be repaired. The words were still echoing through King's Landing when dawn broke, and by midday, the entire court knew that the rogue prince had called the king's newborn son the heir for a day. Viserys was not a vengeful man, but that wound festered, and yet, even as the city buzzed with outrage, Daemon was already moving deeper into the shadows that had always suited him best. It was here, in the stews and alleys of the capital's poorest district, that he found a kind of freedom the Red Keep could never offer, and it was here that he found Mysaria. She was called the White Wyrm, though no one said that name to her face. A dancer from Lys, with pale skin and silver gold hair that caught the torchlight like spun moonlight. She had come to Westeros as a child, sold into servitude, and clawed her way into a life of her own making. By the time Daemon noticed her, she had already built a network of whispers that stretched from the docks to the dungeons. She knew secrets before the lords who kept them did, and she knew how to survive. Daemon was drawn to her not just for her beauty, but for her mind. She spoke several languages, read people with unnerving accuracy, and never once flinched at the violence that clung to his reputation. In her, he found a confidant who understood that power was not only won on battlefields or in council chambers, but in the quiet exchange of information, in the careful cultivation of loyalty among the forgotten. She became his eyes and ears in the city, the one person he trusted to tell him the truth, no matter how bitter. But it was the scandal of the stolen dragon egg that truly cemented her role in his life. For months, whispers had circulated that an egg had gone missing from the Dragonmont at Dragonstone. Not just any egg, a Targaryen egg, pale as bone with veins of gold meant for a royal cradle. The loss was a humiliation for the crown, and suspicion fell heavily upon Daemon. He had always been reckless, always reachable by temptation, and he had in fact taken the egg, not for himself, but for a purpose that only he and Mysaria understood. He gave it to her, not as a gift, but as a tool. She was to smuggle it out of King's Landing and secure a fortune that would fund his ambitions. But the plan unravelled when Viserys discovered the theft. The king was furious, not merely at the loss of the egg, but at the insult. The implication that Daemon would treat a symbol of Targaryen legacy as a bargaining chip. Viserys summoned his brother to Dragonstone, and the confrontation that followed was cold and sharp. Daemon stood before the throne of the Conqueror, the great stone chair of Aegon the Dragon, and denied nothing. He did not grovel. He did not apologize. Instead, he spoke of the Stepstones, of the war he intended to wage against the Triarchy, and of the necessity of gold. He told Viserys that the egg was a means to an end, nothing more. The king, pale with anger, demanded its return, and Daemon, with a smile that held no warmth, agreed. But the damage was done. The trust between brothers had been corroded further, and Otto Hightower, ever watchful, recorded every detail of the affair to use against Daemon when the time came. Yet what Otto did not know, what almost no one knew, was that the stolen egg had never truly been the point. Mysaria had already copied the messages that passed through the Lysine merchant houses, had already mapped the routes that the Triarchy's spies used, and had already begun feeding Daemon intelligence that would keep him one step ahead of his enemies for years to come. She was the invisible hand behind his victories. While he rode Caraxes into battle, she wove webs of information that turned his enemies' plans against them. She knew when Otto Hightower was plotting, knew when the Velaryons were wavering, knew when the crown was about to act, and she passed that knowledge to Daemon in whispers, in coded notes, in the flicker of a candle in a window. The White Wyrm's influence grew quietly, unseen, like roots beneath a castle floor. Daemon had always been a creature of fire and blood, but now he had something else. A shadow that moved with him, that saw what he could not. And as the realm drifted toward a war that would consume them all, that shadow would prove more valuable than any dragon. But not everyone was blind to it. Corlys Velaryon, the sea snake, had his own sources, and he began to suspect that Daemon's sudden successes were not merely luck, and there were others, dispossessed lords and bitter knights, who watched the rogue prince with interest. They saw in him a leader who defied the crown's softness, who embraced the old Targaryen fire. They would soon seek him out, offering swords and loyalty, drawn by the promise of a war that could reshape the realm. That alliance of the Disinherited was already forming, and it would carry Daemon further than he had ever dared to dream. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let our global community know. And if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. The scandal of the stolen dragon egg had burned through King's Landing like wildfire, and Daemon Targaryen was once again the subject of every whispered conversation from the Red Keep to the meanest tavern in Flea Bottom. He had fled the capital for Dragonstone, but not in disgrace. No, he carried with him the allegiance of the Gold Cloaks, the loyalty of a network of spies, and the unsettling affection of a Lysine dancer who had proven herself far more than a passing fancy. The city could talk all it wanted. Daemon was done with the small councils and the endless courtly games. He had something else in mind, something far larger than a stolen egg. It was in the early months of 104, after the conquest, that a messenger arrived at Dragonstone, carrying a sealed letter bearing the seal of the House Velaryon. Lord Corlys Velaryon, the sea snake himself, was requesting a meeting, not at court, not Driftmark, but at a neutral location, a quiet fishing village on the coast of the narrow sea, far from the prying eyes of the crown. Daemon did not hesitate. He mounted caraxes before the ink on the letter had dried, and within a day he was standing on a rocky shore, the salt spray stinging his face, watching the great silver-haired lord approach from his own ship. Corlys Velaryon was a man who commanded every room he entered, and he entered this one with the measured confidence of someone who had sailed the world and seen its wonders. He was not old, but he was weathered, his skin tanned by sun and salt, his eyes sharp as the edge of a Valyrian steel blade. He had been the master of the greatest fleet in Westeros, the richest man in the realm, and the husband of the woman many called the Queen, who never was. He had every reason to be loyal to the Iron Throne, but he was not. The two men stood on that lonely beach, the wind howling between them, and they did not waste time with pleasantries. They spoke of the Stepstones, a chain of barren, sun-scorched islands that choked the trade routes between Westeros and Essos, a pirate's nest controlled by the Triarchy. 3 allied cities from across the narrow sea who had grown bold enough to raid the shores of the 7 kingdoms themselves. Merchant ships burned, villages were sacked. The small folk of the Stormlands and Dawn cried out for protection, and the crown did nothing. King Viserys, Daemon's own brother, had been counselled by Otto Hightower to avoid war at all costs. The Stepstones were not worth the blood, Otto argued. The Triarchy was a distant threat. Let them have their pirate islands. They would grow bored and turn on each other, but Corlys knew better. Every ship lost to the Corsairs was a ship that would never return his investment. Every delay in trade cost him gold, and gold was the blood of his house. More than that, Corlys was a man of action, a man who had built his legacy on exploration and conquest. To sit idle while lawless men plundered his waters was an insult he could not bear. Daemon understood that resentment completely. He had felt it himself. Time and again, in the cramped chambers of the small council, the endless talk, the cautious whispers, the refusal to act while enemies grew stronger. His brother was a good man, but a weak king, and weakness in a king invited wolves to the door. The crown's passivity regarding the Stepstones was not wisdom. It was cowardice dressed in the robes of prudence. And so on that windswept shore, an alliance was forged. Not a treaty signed in ink and sealed with wax, but a handshake between 2 proud men who had been pushed too far. Corlys Velaryon would fund the war. He had the gold, the ships, the supplies. Daemon would lead it. He had the dragon, the sword, and the hunger for glory that had been denied him for so long. They would raise a private army. Not a royal host, not sanctioned by the Iron Throne, but a force of sellswords, dispossessed knights, adventurers, and outcasts who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. They called themselves the Alliance of the Disinherited. Men who had been cast aside by lords and kings, men who had no place in the ordered world of Westeros, would find a new home in the chaos of war. Corlys spoke of his ships, dozens of them, sleek and fast and bristling with archers. Daemon spoke of Caraxes, the Blood Wyrm, whose flames could turn a fleet to ash. They planned not as rebels, but as conquerors. They would take the Stepstones island by island, fort by fort, until the Triarchy was driven back across the sea. And when the crown finally took notice, when Viserys and his hand realised what was happening, it would be too late. Daemon and Corlys would have carved out a kingdom of their own. A crown for the rogue prince, a secure trade route for the sea snake, and a message to every lord in the realm that the old powers were not the only ones who could shape the future. The meeting ended as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the waves in shades of crimson and gold. Daemon mounted Caraxes, and Corlys returned to his ship. They did not speak again that night. They did not need to. The plan was set. The war for the Stepstones was coming, and nothing, not the crown, not the Triarchy, not the cautious counsel of Otto Hightower, would stop it. Daemon looked back once at the fading shape of the Velaryon vessel, and he smiled. For the first time in years, he was not a prince waiting for a throne. He was a king in search of a crown, and he would find it among the rocks and salt of that froth chain of islands, where fire and blood would write the next chapter of his legend. The alliance between Daemon Targaryen and Lord Corlys Velaryon was sealed in the shadows of Driftmark, a pact born of shared resentment and mutual ambition. The sea snake had spent years amassing the wealth of the known world through trade and exploration, but the Stepstones had become a festering wound in his dominion. Those rocky islands, strung like a chain of broken teeth between the shores of Westeros and Essos, had fallen to the Triarchy, an alliance of 3 free cities from across the narrow sea. And at the heart of that occupation stood a commander the small folk whispered of in dread: Drahar, the crab feeder. Daemon listened as Corlys laid out the scale of the threat. The Triarchy's pirates and sellswords had turned the Stepstones into a fortress of coves and sea caves, striking at every passing ship that dared fly Velaryon colours. King Viserys, Daemon's own brother, had done nothing. The crown was content to let the trade routes wither, let the taxes bleed, let the sea snake's pride be ground into salt and sand. But Daemon saw something else in that invitation, a chance to forge a kingdom of his own, to prove that the blood of the dragon did not bow to the whims of idle lords in King's Landing. So in the year 105 after the conquest, Daemon Targaryen mounted Caraxes, the Blood Wyrm, and took to the skies above the Stepstones for the first time. The war that followed was not a grand clash of armies under bright banners. It was a slow, grinding nightmare of ambushes and sieges, fought in blistering heat and choking dust, on beaches where the tide washed away the blood before it could stain the sand. For years, Daemon and Corlys led their forces against the Triarchy's fortified positions, but the crab feeder was no fool. Drahar knew these islands better than any chart, and he used every cave, every narrow gully, every submerged reef as a weapon. Daemon's tactical brilliance began to show itself in the most unlikely ways. He learned that directly assaulting the crabfeeder's strongholds was suicide. The archers could rain arrows from hidden ledges, and the crossbowmen could fire from behind stone folds that seemed to breathe with the sea. So Daemon changed the game. He took to the caves himself, leading small bands of Velaryon marines and sellswords through underground passages that opened onto the enemy's rear. In the dark, with only the hiss of Carax's distant roar for guidance, he hunted the hunters. He turned the crab feeder's own terrain against him, using the island's honeycomb of rock to trap and slaughter patrol after patrol. But the war was not won in a season. It stretched into 106, then 107, then 108. The years of grueling attrition tested every fibre of Daemon's resolve. Supplies ran thin. Men died of fever faster than they died of sword wounds. Corlys's ships grew weary of blockading ports that never truly surrendered, and through it all, Daemon remained on the islands, refusing to retreat, refusing to call for his brother's help. He would rather die in this cursed chain of rocks than return to court a failure. It was on the beaches of Bloodstone, the largest of the Stepstones, that Daemon's leadership faced its hardest trial. The crab feeder had pulled back into a fortified cove, his forces huddled behind wooden palisades and trenches. Day after day, Daemon's men charged into a storm of bolts and arrows, and day after day they were thrown back. The sand grew slick with gore, the carrion birds grew fat, and Daemon, standing atop a ridge with Dark Sister in his hand, watched his army bleed. He could have pulled back, waited out the winter, let the crab feeder starve, but that was not the way of the dragon. He devised a final desperate gambit. Under cover of a moonless night, Daemon led 100 of his best men through a sea cave that opened directly behind the crab feeder's lines. Caraxes, his dragon, flew high above, a red shadow against the stars, drawing the enemy's attention with bursts of flame and false attacks. When Daemon emerged from the cave's mouth, the crab feeder's camp was unguarded from the rear. The slaughter was swift and brutal. Daemon himself found Drahar in his command tent, wreathed in smoke and the stench of saltpeter. The crab feeder died on the blade of Dark Sister, his body left for the crabs he had so long fed. The war for the Stepstones was effectively over. Corlys Velaryon, standing on that same blood-soaked beach, placed a crown of driftwood and iron upon Daemon's head and proclaimed him King of the Stepstones and the Narrow Sea. It was a title Daemon had dreamed of for years, a crown bought with sweat and steel, and the loyalty of men who had followed him into the dark. But even as the cheers echoed across the islands, Daemon knew that this kingdom was a fragile one. The crown, after all, was still his brother's to give or take away, and in the halls of the Red Keep, the real war was just beginning. For his next chapter, the one that would earn him the name King of the Narrow Sea, was not fought on sand and rock. In the hearts of those who held the true power of Westeros, the beaches of the Stepstones had seen months of blood and fire. The Triarchy's forces, led by the crab feeder Drahar, had been driven back cave by cave, island by island, but the final stroke was yet to come. Daemon Targaryen, mounted on Caraxes, had learned the art of waiting. For weeks, he had observed the enemy's supply routes from the sky, watching the cogs and galleys that crept between the rocky islets, carrying grain and arrows and fresh soldiers from the free cities. He knew that the crab feeder's strength was not in open battle. The Myrish crossbowmen and Lysine sellswords were deadly but weary. They had been pinned on the easternmost island of Grey Gallows, their last stronghold, a fortress of black stone and jagged cliffs. And then, in the early spring of 109 after the conquest, Daemon made his move. He did not come with a great fleet or a massive army. He came with Caraxes, and with a small band of knights and sellswords who had followed him through every skirmish. Lord Corlys Velaryon's ships blocked the sea approaches, but Daemon took to the land. He led a night march across a narrow causeway that the Triarchy thought impassable, wading through salt marsh and tangled briar. By dawn, his men were at the gates of the fortress. The crab feeder, emerging to meet this unexpected assault, was cut down in the first clash. Some say Daemon himself struck the fatal blow, his Valyrian steel blade Dark Sister slicing through the bronze armour of the Lysine admiral. Others whisper that the crab feeder was taken alive and fed to Caraxes on the beach. Whatever the truth, the Triarchy's resistance shattered. By midday, the remaining captains surrendered. The war for the Stepstones was over. On the very spot where the crab feeder had made his last stand, Lord Corlys Velaryon placed a crown upon Daemon's head. It was not a crown of gold and jewels from the Iron Throne. It was a simple circle of black iron, forged in the camp's smithy, meant to be discarded or melted down. But to Daemon, it was everything. He raised his sword to the sky and proclaimed himself King of the Stepstones and the Narrow Sea. The men cheered. Caraxes roared, his cry echoing across the islands. And on that day, a second Targaryen kingdom was born. Not in the west, not on the continent of Westeros, but in the turbulent waters that linked the free cities to the Seven Kingdoms. The implications of this new kingdom were enormous. The Stepstones had long been a nightmare for merchants and princes alike, a nest of pirates and corsairs that choked the trade routes between Pentos, Myre and Lys. Now they were ruled by a Targaryen. Daemon controlled the very sea lanes that the Triarchy had used to enrich itself. He could levy tolls, grant passage, or close the waters entirely. The free cities watched with alarm. They had lost their puppet state, and in its place stood a dragon prince with a dragon of his own. Some sent envoys offering tribute, hoping to buy safe passage. Others began plotting their revenge. But for the moment, Daemon was master of the narrow sea. News of the crowning reached King's Landing within a fortnight. King Viserys sat in the Red Keep, his council divided. Otto Hightower argued that Daemon had committed treason. He had declared himself king without the consent of the Iron Throne, and his ambitions would inevitably bring war. But Viserys was tired of his brother's defiance. He had exiled Daemon, banished him, and yet here Daemon was, not begging for forgiveness, but ruling a kingdom of his own making. Some whispered that Viserys was secretly proud, that he saw in Daemon the fire of old Valyria that had grown dim in the peaceful court. After weeks of deliberation, Viserys did something unexpected. He sent a raven to the Stepstones, not a demand for surrender, but a letter of acknowledgement. He addressed Daemon as our rightfully anointed king of the Stepstones, though he insisted that the realm remained one and that Daemon held his crown by Viserys' grace. It was a fragile peace, a patch over a wound that had festered for years. Daemon accepted the gesture. He had won what he wanted, a kingdom, a legacy, and the respect of the world. But more than that, he had won a moment of reconciliation with his brother. In the summer of 109, Daemon sailed back to King's Landing. He came not as a rebel or an exile, but as a king. Viserys met him on the steps of the throne room. For a long moment, the brothers simply looked at each other. Then Viserys embraced him. The court held its breath. For a few precious months, the Targaryen dynasty stood united. Daemon visited the nursery to see his nieces, dined with his brother, and even attended a small council meeting. It seemed that the rogue prince had finally found his place. But the peace, like the Stepstones tides, was destined to change. The crown Daemon had forged was not woven from gold. It was made of iron, and iron is cold. And the love between brothers, no matter how genuine, could not erase the ambitious scheming that stirred in the capital. As the autumn winds began to blow, Daemon prepared to return to his new kingdom. But the seeds of future conflict had already been sown, and the road ahead would lead him back to the very heart of the realm, where the next chapter of his story would be written. What he would find there would test every bond he had ever built, and set the stage for a return unlike any the Seven Kingdoms had ever seen. The war for the Stepstones had ended with Daemon crowned king, but that crown was never meant to sit easily upon his head. For 2 years, he had held the title of King of the Narrow Sea, ruling from a jagged island fortress, while his brother sat the Iron Throne in King's Landing. The realm had watched with bated breath, wondering if the rogue prince would push east or turn his gaze west toward the Red Keep. But Daemon was no fool. He knew the power of gesture, the weight of public spectacle, and in the spring of 111, he chose to make his move. The grand tourney of that year was meant to celebrate the peace of the realm. King Viserys had called for 7 days of jousting and melee, a display of unity and strength. Lords and ladies from every corner of the Seven Kingdoms gathered in the fields outside the city, their pavilions a sea of silk and heraldry. The royal box was draped in crimson and gold, and there sat the king, his face weary but hopeful, flanked by the hand of the king, Otto Hightower, and the queen. The tourney grounds buzzed with anticipation, but no one expected the entrance that would change everything. A shadow fell across the lists. It came without warning, a dark shape that swallowed the sun for a heartbeat. The crowd gasped as a great red dragon descended from the clouds, its wings beating with a sound like thunder. Caraxes, the Blood Wyrm, landed in the centre of the field, scattering horses and knights alike. Dust and sand billowed outward. The dragon roared, a sound that silenced every trumpet and cheer. Then from the saddle, a figure leaped to the ground. Daemon Targaryen, dressed in black armor, a dark cloak trailing behind him. He wore no crown, but he carried one, cradled in his hands like a sacred relic. He walked forward, alone, through the ranks of stunned spectators. His boots crunched on the gravel. The crowd parted as if before a tide. Daemon's gaze did not waver. It fixed on the royal box on his brother. He climbed the steps slowly, deliberately, until he stood before Viserys. And then, in full view of the realm, he knelt. He placed the crown of the Stepstones, a circle of black iron and driftwood, set with a single ruby, at his brother's feet. The silence was absolute. Daemon spoke, his voice clear and carrying. "I am no king. There is only one king in Westeros. I surrender my crown and my sword to you, your grace." The gesture was stunning. It was fealty, yes, but it was also a declaration. Daemon was not asking for forgiveness. He was reclaiming his place. He had returned not as a rebel, but as a prince of the blood. Viserys, moved or perhaps wary, rose and embraced his brother. The crowd erupted in cheers, but behind the applause, Otto Hightower's eyes narrowed. He understood the performance for what it was. A bid for power, wrapped in humility. Daemon had not given up his ambition. He had simply changed its shape. As the tourney resumed, Daemon stayed in the royal box. He smiled, he jested, he watched his brother, yet his gaze drifted often toward the distant spires of the Red Keep. The city gates were open to him now. The gold cloaks he once commanded still patrolled the streets, and in the shadows of Flea Bottom, whispers stirred. The rogue prince had come home, but home for Daemon had never been a place of peace. It was a place of plotting. The next move would not come on the field of honor. In the quiet chambers of the castle, where alliances were forged and secrets were kept like poisoned daggers, and in those chambers, a scandal was already stirring, one that would draw Daemon into the heart of the court's darkest corridors and leave a maiden's name forever tarnished. The tourney of 111 had barely ended when the whispers began. Daemon Targaryen had returned to King's Landing, not as a disgraced exile, but as a crowned king who had laid his diadem at his brother's feet. The court was still buzzing with the spectacle of that public submission, when a murkier, far more dangerous rumour started to circulate. It moved through the great hall like smoke, curling into every alcove and corridor. The rogue prince, it was said, had taken a special interest in his niece, the Princess Rhaenyra, and the nature of that interest was anything but proper. You have to understand how the court worked in those days. King Viserys had lost his wife, Queen Aemma, and his infant son Balon in a single devastating day. His grief had hollowed him out, left him vulnerable to the counsel of Otto Hightower, a man who saw Daemon as a living threat to everything he was building. Viserys needed an heir, and by the laws of Westeros and the precedent of the Great Council, that heir should have been Daemon. But Otto Hightower whispered otherwise, and the king, still raw from his losses, named his 7-year-old daughter Rhaenyra as Princess of Dragonstone instead. It was a decision that shattered the natural order, and it gave Daemon a wound that never fully healed. And yet Daemon did not rage openly. Instead, he returned to court with a crown in his hand and a smile on his lips. He attended feasts, sparred in the training yard, and made a show of loyalty, but his eyes kept drifting toward Rhaenyra. She was not yet a woman, barely 8 years old, but she was already sharp, bold, and Targaryen to the bone. Daemon saw in her something he recognized, a hunger for fire and freedom, and so he began his so-called lessons. The rumors of Daemon's lessons to the young Princess Rhaenyra first surfaced in the kitchens, then in the barracks, and finally in the solar of Otto Hightower himself. What did those lessons involve? The whispers said he took her into the Maidenvault, that secluded tower where the king's female relatives were supposed to be protected from the world. He brought her wineskins, some said. He told her stories of dragon battles and bloody conquests, stories that no proper maester would ever share with a princess. He spoke of the Targaryen right to rule not by law but by fire. He called her a dragon, and he taught her to see herself as above the petty rules of men. The most damning tale came from a serving girl who claimed to have seen Daemon and Rhaenyra alone in a chamber late one night. The girl swore the princess was laughing, her silver hair loose, her gown undone at the shoulder. Daemon stood close, his hand on her chin, tilting her face toward the moonlight. He was whispering something, and the girl could not hear the words, but she knew a boundary had been crossed. Whether that boundary was physical or merely emotional did not matter. In the court of King's Landing, perception was truth, and the perception was that the rogue prince was grooming the heir to the Iron Throne. Purposes no honourable man could defend. Otto Hightower moved quickly. He brought the rumours to King Viserys, laying them out with the cold precision of a man who had been waiting for this moment. He did not accuse Daemon of outright treason, not yet. He simply painted a portrait of a prince who had returned from exile only to corrupt the king's own daughter, to poison her mind against proper counsel, and to treat the Maidenvault as if it were his own personal pleasure house. Viserys listened, his face hardened, and then he summoned his brother. The confrontation between the king and the prince was the stuff of legend, though no one can say precisely what was spoken. The doors to the throne room were sealed, but the guards outside heard raised voices, the crash of a goblet thrown against stone, and then a long, terrible silence. When Daemon emerged, his expression was unreadable. He walked past Otto Hightower without a glance, past the courtiers who had gathered to watch, and out into the night. The next morning, the word came down from the Red Keep. Prince Daemon Targaryen was once again banished from court. This time, he was stripped of all titles and honours, including his position as commander of the City Watch. He was ordered to return to the Vale, to his wife, Lady Rhea Royce, and to remain there until the king decided otherwise. But the banishment was more than a punishment. It was a declaration of war. The explosive fallout that led to Daemon's second banishment from court had cracked something irreparable between the brothers. Viserys had always been patient, always willing to forgive Daemon's provocations, because he loved him. But this time, the target was his daughter, and no amount of love could survive that kind of betrayal. Rhaenyra herself was questioned by the maesters, but she denied everything. She was a child, and she may not have understood the weight of what Daemon had done, or she may have understood perfectly and chosen to protect him. Either way, the damage was done. From that moment on, the relationship between the king and the prince was permanently fractured. They would never again share a table without suspicion. They would never again speak as brothers. Viserys would spend the rest of his reign looking over his shoulder, wondering if Daemon was plotting his return, and Daemon, stripped of everything he had earned in the Stepstones, would retreat to the Vale, to a wife he despised, to a castle that felt like a cage, and to a plan that would one day bring him back to the capital with fire in his wake. But before that plan could take shape, a death would come that changed everything. Not a death on a battlefield, not a death by dragon flame, but a death in the Vale that would open a door Daemon had been trying to force shut for years. Daemon Targaryen had been banished from King's Landing once again, and this time the wound cut deeper than any exile he had known before. The rumours of those lessons he had given to Princess Rhaenyra, whispers of stolen innocence in the shadows of the Maidenvault, had spread like wildfire through the Red Keep. King Viserys, his own brother, had turned his face away in disgust and ordered him gone, and so the rogue prince mounted Caraxes, the Blood Wyrm, and took to the skies with a heart full of fury and a mind already spinning new threads of ambition. But he did not fly far. Not yet. There was a chain that still bound him, a marriage that had been a noose around his neck since the age of 16. Lady Rhea Royce, his bronze bride of the Vale, still lived, and while she lived, Daemon could never truly be free. He could never marry again, never press a claim, never build a kingdom that was entirely his own. The bronze bitch, as he called her in his more bitter moments, remained the final obstacle to his personal and political independence. And in the Vale, far from the eyes of the court, an opportunity was about to present itself. It began with a hunting accident. Rhea Royce, Lady of Runestone, was a woman of the Vale, born to the harsh rocky slopes of the Mountains of the Moon. She was no soft courtier, but a rider and a hunter in her own right. One morning, she set out with her falcon and a small party, pursuing game through the high passes that overlooked the Bay of Crabs. The day was crisp, the air thin and sharp with the coming winter. Her horse picked its way along a narrow trail, and then something went wrong. Accounts differ on the exact cause, but the result was the same. Her mount stumbled, or perhaps a rockslide broke loose, or perhaps something more deliberate was at play. Rhea was thrown from the saddle and struck her head against a jagged outcrop of stone. She lingered for a fortnight, drifting in and out of consciousness, but never recovered. In the 9th month of the year 109 AC, Lady Rhea Royce died of her injuries, and a cheer went up in the mind of a prince who was 1,000 miles away, or perhaps not so far away. The timing was suspicious, and tongues wagged in every corner of the realm. Had Daemon arranged it? Had he sent an agent to the Vale? Or had he simply whispered a wish into the wind and let fate do the rest? No proof ever surfaced, and no accusation was ever formally made. The Lords of the Vale conducted their own inquiry and found nothing but a tragic accident. But the truth, as it so often is in the history of the Targaryens, is buried under layers of silence and convenience. What mattered was that Rhea Royce was dead, and Daemon Targaryen was a widower at last. He wasted no time. Within days of learning of her death, Daemon flew Caraxes over the Mountains of the Moon and descended upon Runestone. The castle of House Royce was old, built of black stone, carved with the ancient runes of the first men, and it commanded a strong position overlooking the Vale. Daemon expected to claim it in his own name. After all, he had been Rhea's husband for more than a decade. The lands and the castle should have passed to him by right of marriage. But the Lords of the Vale were not so eager to hand their ancestral seat to a Targaryen prince, who had never even lived among them, who had openly mocked their customs, and who had made no secret of his contempt for his wife. When Daemon arrived at the gates of Runestone, he found them barred. The Castellan, loyal to the memory of Rhea and to the honour of House Royce, refused him entry. Daemon demanded that the Lords of the Vale recognise his claim, but they convened a council and declared that the inheritance of Runestone would pass to a cousin of Rhea's, a man named Ser Gerald Royce, who was already on his way from the Fingers. Daemon was left standing on the cold stones of the courtyard, the wind howling across the high plains, with nothing but Caraxes' hissing breath and the weight of a failed gambit. He could have unleashed the Blood Wyrm upon those ancient walls and taken Runestone by fire and blood, but that would have been an act of war against a major house of the realm. And even Daemon knew that such a move would bring the full wrath of the crown down upon him. His brother would not protect him this time. Otto Hightower would see it as the final proof of his villainy, and so for the first time in his life, Daemon Targaryen chose retreat. He mounted Caraxes and fled the Vale, leaving behind the bronze runes and the cold stone of a castle that would never be his. He flew east, over the sea, toward the ragged islands that stretched like bones across the narrow sea, the Stepstones, where he had once carved a kingdom out of blood and salt, awaited him. But even as he flew, his mind was already turning to another prize, another woman, another path to power. Rhea's death had removed the final obstacle to his personal and political freedom. He could now marry again, and he knew exactly whom he wanted. The wheels were already turning in the Red Keep, where a princess waited, still young, still hungry, still bound to him by ties of blood and attraction that no amount of scandal could sever. The union of fire and sea was still months away, but the currents were shifting beneath the surface, and Daemon Targaryen was about to set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the very future of the realm. The mysterious hunting accident that claimed Rhea Royce left Daemon Targaryen a widower at last, but the gates of Runestone slammed shut in his face. He had arrived in the Vale, expecting to claim his late wife's lands and title as the Lord of Runestone by right of marriage. Instead, the Royce cousins and their bannermen turned him away, refusing to acknowledge any claim from a man who had spent years mocking their house and their lady. Daemon, never one to linger where he was unwelcome, mounted Caraxes and left the Vale in a storm of dragon wings and bitter ash. He had no home now. King's Landing was closed to him, Dragonstone belonged to his brother, and the Stepstones had been surrendered. For the first time in years, the rogue prince was truly adrift, but not for long. Even in exile, Daemon Targaryen had a talent for landing on his feet, and more often than not, those landings happened in the company of powerful women. Word of Rhea Royce's death reached him before he had even crossed the Bay of Crabs, and with it, the knowledge that he was free to marry again, and he already knew exactly whom he wanted. Not Rhaenyra, not yet. The scandal of their rumoured lessons in the Maidenvault still burned too brightly in the king's memory. Instead, his eyes turned south, to the shores of Driftmark, to a house that had once been his ally in war, and would now become his family by choice. Lady Laena Velaryon was the daughter of Lord Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake, and Princess Rhaenys Targaryen, the queen who never was. She was young, barely 16 when Daemon first began to court her, but she was also bold, fierce, and, crucially, she rode a dragon of her own, the pale blue she-dragon Varga, the largest and most fearsome beast in the world since the death of Balerion. Laena had grown up hearing tales of her mother's lost crown and her father's adventures across the seas. She was not the sort of woman to be intimidated by a rogue prince with a sword and a temper. In fact, she seemed drawn to him precisely because of his danger. Their courtship was swift and whirlwind. Daemon arrived at Driftmark not long after his flight from the Vale, fresh from his rejection at Runestone, and he wasted no time in presenting himself to Lord Corlys. The Sea Snake, ever the pragmatist, saw the match as a way to bind the Velaryon bloodline even closer to the Iron Throne, especially given that Daemon was still the king's brother, and, for all his troubles, remained a prince of the realm. Corlys gave his blessing before the week was out, and Laena herself, by all accounts, needed no convincing. She had seen Daemon at the tourney of 111, had watched him crown Rhaenyra as the Queen of Love and Beauty, and had felt the electric tension that followed him everywhere. Now she would be his queen, at least in the small kingdom of their marriage. The wedding itself was a quiet affair by Targaryen standards, held on the shores of Driftmark, with the salt spray and the sound of waves as witnesses. No great feast at the Red Keep, no royal procession through the streets of King's Landing. King Viserys was not consulted beforehand, and when he learned of the marriage, his fury was cold and absolute. To him, this was not merely a political slight, it was a betrayal. Daemon had married the daughter of his most powerful lord without asking leave. And worse, he had done it in the shadow of the scandal with Rhaenyra. The king saw it as an act of defiance, a signal that Daemon would do as he pleased, regardless of the crown's authority. And so, before the wedding night had even passed, word arrived from King's Landing. Daemon Targaryen was banished once more. He was to leave Westeros immediately, and this time, he was not to return until the king himself summoned him. Daemon did not hesitate. He gathered his new wife, their servants, and a small retinue, and he set sail for the free cities. The flight to Essos was not a retreat, it was a declaration. He would build his own life beyond the reach of his brother's throne, far from the scheming of Otto Hightower and the whispers of the court. And Laena, young and adventurous, seemed almost thrilled by the prospect. She had never known true freedom outside the walls of Driftmark, and now she would ride beside her husband across the lands of the east, on the back of the largest dragon alive. Their destination was Pentos, the wealthy and opulent city on the coast of the disputed lands. The Prince of Pentos, a merchant prince named Drazenko something, the exact name is lost to history, welcomed them with open arms. There were still those in the free cities who remembered Daemon from the war in the Stepstones, who owed in favours or feared his dragon. In Pentos, they were given a manse overlooking the sea, gardens of lemon and olive trees, and a life of leisure that seemed, for a time, idyllic. It was in Pentos that Lena gave birth to twin daughters. In the year 115 after the conquest, they named them Vale and Rhaena. Strong Valyrian names that echoed the ancient queens and dragons of their bloodline. The twins were healthy, with silver hair and violet eyes, and Daemon, for all his reputation as a rogue, seemed genuinely devoted to them. He would spend hours watching them sleep, or carrying them on his shoulders through the courtyards of the Pentoshi manse. For the first time in his life, had something to protect that was entirely his own. These years in Pentos were the calmest in Daemon's entire story. There were no wars to fight, no lords to scheme against, no king's justice to evade. The days passed in a lazy rhythm of dragon-riding displays over the bay, where Daemon and Laena would take Caraxes and Vargar aloft together, their monstrous shadows sweeping across the fishing boats below. The people of Pentos had never seen anything like it. Two dragons, one blood red and the other pale blue, twisting and diving in the sunlight. It was a spectacle that drew crowds to the harbour every time. Daemon would sometimes hover low over the water, letting Caraxes' breath scorch the waves, just to hear the gasps and cheers of the onlookers. But peaceful as it was, it could not last. Daemon Targaryen was not made for peace. The rogue prince felt the pull of Westeros like a constant ache, a hunger that no amount of lemon wine or dragon rides could satisfy. He began to send ravens to his brother, testing the waters, searching for a crack in the king's resolve. And Laena, for her part, began to grow restless as well. She missed her family, the salt air of Driftmark, the politics and purpose of the court. Pentos was a beautiful cage, but a cage nonetheless. It was in this quiet tension that the seeds of the next tragedy were sown. Laena would become pregnant again in the year 120, and that pregnancy would end in a death that shattered the fragile peace of their eastern exile. The story of what happened at Driftmark in the final hours of Lady Laena's life is one of the most haunting moments in the Dance of the Dragons, a chapter that would change everything for Daemon, for Rhaenyra, and for the realm itself. But that is a tale for the next chapter, and the calm of Pentos still had a few more months left before the storm. For years, Daemon Targaryen and Laena Velaryon had carved out a life of peace and contentment in the free cities, far from the political storms of King's Landing. Their flights on Dragonback across the smoking ruins of Valyria, the birth of their twin daughters, Baela and Rhaena in 115 AC. These were the quiet years of a man who had finally found a measure of happiness. But happiness, for the rogue prince, was never meant to last. By 120 AC, Laena was pregnant once more. Corlys Velaryon, her father, had long since forgiven Daemon for past transgressions, and the family had returned to Driftmark, the ancestral seat of High Tide, so that Laena might be attended by the finest maesters in the realm. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. Laena, now in her late 20s, had already given birth to twins, and her body was not what it once was. Yet she insisted on carrying the child to term, believing that a son would secure the Velaryon legacy. The labour began on a stormy night, the winds howling across the narrow sea as if the very elements mourned what was to come. Daemon stood outside the chamber, his hand never leaving the hilt of Dark Sister. He heard her screams, muffled by the thick stone walls, each one a dagger to his heart. The maesters emerged, their faces pale, whispering of a breech birth, of blood that would not stop. Laena, ever the dragon rider, refused to die quietly in a bed. In her final moments, she called for her dragon, Vargar, the ancient beast that had once belonged to Visenya Targaryen herself. She wanted to feel the wind to fly one last time, but she was too weak. The maesters held her down, and the child, a stillborn boy, was delivered. Moments later, Laena Velaryon bled out into the sheets, her eyes fixed on the window, where she could see the silhouette of Vhagar circling above. Daemon was there when she passed. He did not weep, not where anyone could see. He simply took her hand, kissed her forehead, and whispered something that no one ever heard. The news spread like wildfire. Laena Velaryon, daughter of the Sea Snake, wife of the Rogue Prince, mother of 2, was dead at the age of 28. The entire realm mourned, but none more than Daemon. His grief took on a cold, hard edge. He did not rage, he did not drink. He became silent, watchful, dangerous. Her body was prepared for the traditional Velaryon funeral. A driftwood pyre set adrift on the tides of the gullet, to be consumed by fire and salt. And it was this funeral that brought the entire Targaryen dynasties together in mourning for the first time in years on the shores of Driftmark. King Viserys have arrived with his entire court, including Queen Alicent Hightower and their children. Rhaenyra came with her husband, Lyonor Velaryon, and their own sons. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tensions. Viserys, his health failing, his body ravaged by illness, leaned on a cane as he walked to the pyre. He embraced Daemon, his brother, his enemy, his only remaining blood. And for a moment, the old wounds seemed to heal, but not all wounds heal. The funeral was a spectacle of grief and politics. Corlys Velaryon stood stoic, his sea-green eyes fixed on the flames. Rhaenys Targaryen, the queen who never was, wept openly for her daughter and the children. Baela and Rhaena, only 5 years old, did not fully understand why their mother was burning on a ship. Daemon stood apart, his arms crossed, his gaze never leaving the fire. It was on that very night, after the pyre had drifted out of sight, that the next tragedy unfolded. The children of the realm, the Targaryen and Velaryon heirs, were gathered at high tide, restless and grieving. Among them was Aemon Targaryen, the second son of King Viserys and Queen Alicent, a boy of 10. He had no dragon, a source of deep shame and envy. His older brother Aegon had Sunfire, his sister Helena had Dreamfire, but Aemond had nothing. And then in the darkness, he saw her, Vhagar, the largest living dragon in the world, the beast that had carried Visenya through the conquest. The dragon of his dead aunt Laena. Vhagar was alone, restless, mourning her rider. Aemond approached her, whispering in High Valyrian, his voice trembling. The dragon sniffed him, allowed him to climb onto her back, and then, with a roar that shook the foundations of Driftmark, Vhagar took to the sky. Aemond claimed her, but the night was far from over. When he landed, the other children confronted him. Prince Jacaerys Velaryon, Rhaenyra's eldest son, demanded to know why Aemond had taken Vhagar. Aemond, emboldened by his new mount, taunted them. Words were exchanged, then blows, and in the chaos, young Lucerys Velaryon, only 7 years old, drew a knife. He slashed Aemond across the face, from brow to chin, carving a deep gash that would scar him for life. Aemond lost an eye that night. The aftermath was chaos. Queen Alicent, enraged, demanded that Lucerys be punished, that he lose an eye in return. King Viserys, weakened and distraught, refused. Rhaenyra defended her son, and Daemon, standing in the shadows, said nothing, but his silence was louder than any shout. The Rogue Prince saw, in that moment, the fractures that would soon tear his family apart. The loss of Laena, the stolen dragon, the maimed prince, all of it was fuel for a fire that had been smouldering for years. Daemon returned to his chambers that night and looked at his twin daughters, sleeping peacefully. He knew that the peace he had found in Essos, the peace he had rebuilt on Driftmark, was shattered, and he knew what he had to do. The Green faction, led by Alicent and her father, Otto Hightower, now had a martyr in Aemond. The Blacks, Rhaenyra's faction, had an aggressor in Lucerys. War was now inevitable. But before the war could begin, Daemon made a decision that shocked even his closest allies. Within weeks of Laena's funeral, he sought out Rhaenyra. They had always shared a dangerous bond, a fire that could not be extinguished. And now, in their shared grief for Laena, and in their shared ambition for the throne, they found each other again. That is the story of Chapter 19. The secret wedding, a union that would alter the course of Westerosi history forever. But for now, the ashes of Driftmark still smouldered. Laena Velaryon was dead. Aemon Targaryen had lost an eye, and Daemon Targaryen, the Rogue Prince, was about to make the most dangerous move of his life. The funeral at Driftmark had barely concluded the salt spray still clinging to the black silks of the mourners, when the seeds of a far more audacious union were already being sown. Laena Velaryon's body had only just been committed to the sea, her twin stillborn sons resting beside her, and yet the air around the Targaryen family crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with grief. For Daemon, the loss of his wife was a wound, but it was also a door, and standing on the other side of that door was Rhaenyra. In the days that followed, the whispers began. They were soft at first, passed between trusted servants, and hushed in the corridors of high tide. Daemon and Rhaenyra had been seen together more often than propriety allowed. Their conversations were long, their glances loaded, and the timing could not have been more incendiary. Rhaenyra's own husband, Laenor Velaryon, had died under circumstances that were never fully explained. A brawl in a pleasure house, a convenient accident. The truth was murky, but one thing was clear. Both Daemon and Rhaenyra were suddenly free, and they wasted no time. Just weeks after Laena's death, and barely a month after Laenor's, a secret ceremony took place. The location was Dragonstone, the ancient fortress of the Targaryen heir, shrouded in volcanic mist and watched over by the stone dragons of the island. There, before a handful of witnesses sworn to absolute silence, Daemon Targaryen and Rhaenyra Targaryen exchanged vows. The ceremony was performed by a septon, whose loyalty was bought with gold, and the only guests were a few trusted members of Rhaenyra's household. There were no songs, no feasts, no declaration to the realm. It was a union born of love, yes, but also of raw political calculation. This marriage was never going to be a quiet affair. When news inevitably leaked, it sent shockwaves through the court at King's Landing. King Viserys, Rhaenyra's father, was furious, not because he disapproved of Daemon, though he had ample reason to, but because the match was made without his consent, and it effectively declared that Rhaenyra was no longer content to wait for the throne. She was building her own power base, and Daemon, the rogue prince who had been banished time and again, was at its centre. The consolidation of what would become known as the Black Faction began the moment those vows were spoken. By marrying Rhaenyra, Daemon brought his own loyalists into her camp. The gold cloaks of King's Landing, whom he had commanded years earlier, remained fiercely devoted to him. The Velaryon fleet, though wary of Daemon's ambition, was bound to Rhaenyra through her late husband's family, and through the twin daughters Daemon had with Laena. And the dragons, oh the dragons. Rhaenyra rode Syrax, Daemon rode Caraxes, and their children would inherit the blood of the Dragon Lords. It was a union of fire and fire, and it made them nearly unstoppable. But the true victory of this marriage would be measured not in armies or alliances, but in heirs. Within a year of their wedding, Rhaenyra was pregnant. In the year 121 after the conquest, she gave birth to a son. They named him Aegon, after Rhaenyra's father the king, but also after the conqueror himself. It was a name heavy with destiny, and the following year, another son arrived, this one named Viserys, after the grandfather who had once loved Daemon, but now could barely stand to look at him. These two boys, Aegon the Younger and Viserys Targaryen, were the living embodiment of the secret wedding's purpose. They secured the line of succession. They ensured that Rhaenyra's claim would not die with her, and they gave Daemon what he had always craved, a dynasty. The whispers of the court turned to open condemnation. The Greens, the faction supporting Queen Alicent and her son Aegon the Elder, decried the marriage as an abomination. Uncle and niece, they said, a union of incest that mocked the gods. But the Targaryens had married brother to sister for centuries. This was no different. It was simply more dangerous. Daemon and Rhaenyra retreated to Dragonstone, their island fortress, and there they built their court in exile. They surrounded themselves with those who believed in Rhaenyra's cause. They trained their dragons. They watched the horizon for the storm that everyone knew was coming. And as the years passed, the children grew. Aegon the Younger learned to ride his own dragon, a hatchling named Stormcloud. Viserys, quieter and more thoughtful, would eventually claim a dragon of his own. The foundation of the Black faction was solid, forged in secrecy and cemented in blood. But the peace of Dragonstone was an illusion. In King's Landing, King Viserys grew frailer with each passing moon. The Greens prepared their own plans, and Daemon, ever the schemer, knew that the moment the king drew his last breath, the realm would tear itself apart. He had married Rhaenyra to claim power, yes, but also to protect her. He would not let her be destroyed by the vipers of the Red Keep. He would be her sword, her shield, her dragon, and that is exactly what he became. In the years that followed, Daemon Targaryen would earn the title Lord of Dragonstone in more than name. He would transform that bleak volcanic island into a fortress of defiance, a rallying point for every lord and lady who believed that Rhaenyra was the rightful queen. But the true test of his loyalty and of the power of that secret wedding was still to come. The Dance of the Dragons was not yet a war, but it was already a certainty, and Daemon, the rogue prince, would be its most dangerous player. I hope you're as amazed by this as I am. If you want to stay updated on more content like this, make sure to subscribe and join our community of curious minds. Trust me, what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew. The secret wedding on Driftmark had bound Daemon and Rhaenyra together in a union that defied convention, defied the gods, and defied the whispers of every courtier in the realm. Within weeks of burying their dead, they had wed in the sept beneath Dragonstone's ancient stone, and the fire of their alliance had already begun to reshape the world around them. But a marriage, even one forged in dragonfire, could not by itself secure a throne. The real work was just beginning. Daemon Targaryen, now Lord of Dragonstone in name and deed, understood something that Rhaenyra, for all her ambition, still hesitated to accept. King Viserys was dying. His body, ravaged by the slow corruption of his ulcers and the weight of 2 decades of rule, had become a constant, brittle reminder that time was running out. The king could no longer climb the stairs to the Iron Throne without a litter, could no longer hold court for more than a few hours without collapsing into feverish sleep. Daemon saw it every time he visited the Red Keep, and he saw it with a clarity that bordered on cold calculation. He was not a man given to sentiment. He had loved his brother once, in the way a younger brother loves the golden elder who shields him from the world. But that love had curdled into something more complicated, a mixture of pity, resentment, and the cold certainty that Viserys' weakness would soon doom them all. Daemon had no intention of letting that happen, so he became Rhaenyra's protector, not in the soft romantic sense that the bards sang of, but in the brutal practical sense of a man who would slaughter an entire army to shield the woman he loved and the claim she carried. He took on the role of chief strategist for her court, a court that was still forming its bones. Dragonstone became the heart of the Black faction, a fortress of volcanic stone where the loyalists gathered. Lord Corlys Velaryon, still grieving the loss of his daughter Laena, threw the full weight of his fleet behind Rhaenyra, his ships painting the narrow sea with the sails of House Velaryon. Other houses began to send their sons and their oaths. The Starks of the North, the Arryns of the Vale, the Tullys of the Riverlands. They all rallied to the heir, either from loyalty to the memory of their oaths sworn to Viserys, or from the quiet fear of what Daemon might do if they refused. And Daemon, ever the rogue, moulded this nascent court into a war machine. He drilled the knights, inspected the garrisons, and personally oversaw the training of the Gold Cloaks, the men he had once commanded in King's Landing. He knew each man's name, each man's weakness, each man's price. He was not popular, not in the way that Rhaenyra was beloved, but he was feared, and fear, as Daemon had learned in the Stepstones, was a far more reliable currency than love. Meanwhile, the Green faction in King's Landing was also hardening. Queen Alicent, once Rhaenyra's sweet stepmother, had become a hawk, her eyes fixed on the prize of her son Aegon's crown. She surrounded herself with men like Otto Hightower, her father, and Sir Criston Cole, whose hatred for Daemon and Rhaenyra had fermented into a personal vendetta. The court was splitting, and every whisper, every letter, Every silent glance between lords carried the weight of a coming war. Daemon watched it all from Dragonstone, perched on the fortress's highest tower. With caraxes coiled in the courtyard below, he would often stand there for hours, hand resting on the pommel of Dark Sister, feeling the Valyrian steel hum against his palm. The blade was old, ancient, forged in the fires of old Valyria, and he had carried it for 20 years. But now, in the quiet hours before dawn, he would take it to the armory and sharpen it himself, running the whetstone along the edge with a slow, deliberate rhythm. It was not a nervous habit, it was a promise. Each scrape of stone against steel was a preparation for the storm. He knew, with the certainty of a man who had survived 100 betrayals, that Viserys' death would not be a peaceful transition. The Greens would make their move the moment the king drew his last breath, if not sooner. And when that moment came, Daemon would need to be ready, not just as a commander, but as the sword of Rhaenyra's cause. Dark Sister would not merely be a symbol, it would be the instrument that carved a path through the heart of the Green conspiracy. He thought often of the prophecy, the song of ice and fire, the dream of Aegon the Conqueror that his brother had whispered to Rhaenyra. Daemon cared little for prophecy. He had seen too much blood and too much broken hope to trust in visions of a future he might not live to see. But he understood that the throne was not a prize. It was a tool, and if Rhaenyra could sit upon it, she might unite the realm against the darkness that was coming. If Aegon the Second took it instead, he would bleed the realm dry in petty war, leaving it weak for the winter that was sure to follow. So Daemon sharpened his blade, and he sharpened his mind. He read the reports from his spies in the capital. He studied the maps of the Reach, the Riverlands, the Crownlands. He marked the strengths and weaknesses of every house, and he began to weave a web of alliances that would hold, even when the king's body finally failed. But time was a luxury that neither he nor Rhaenyra possessed. Viserys' health was failing faster than anyone in the Red Keep dared admit. The king's hand trembled when he signed decrees. His breath rattled like dry leaves in the wind. The flesh of his arm had begun to rot from the years of the Iron Throne's poisoned touch. The maesters whispered that he might live another year, but Daemon knew better. He had seen men die before, and he knew the look of one who was already standing in the shadows of the stranger. And as winter's first snow fell on the peaks of Dragonstone, Daemon stood in the courtyard, watching Rhaenyra train with a practiced sword. She was fierce, born of dragon blood, but her belly was already swelling with their child. The child would be born into a world on the brink of fire. Daemon allowed himself a rare, almost tender smile. Then he turned away, his hand moving to the hilt of Dark Sister. He did not know exactly when the blow would fall, but he knew who would strike first, and he was ready. The coming storm would have a name, whispered in the halls of the Red Keep, and shouted in the streets of Flea Bottom. It would be a usurpation, green as poison, and it would ignite a war that would burn through every corner of the realm. The pieces were already moving. Viserys' crown would not pass peacefully, and the story of that war, of the dance of dragons and the betrayal that set it all in motion, was about to begin. That is what we will uncover in the next chapter, the Green Usurpation. The realm had been holding its breath for years, waiting for the moment when King Viserys would finally pass from the world. Daemon, on Dragonstone, knew that his brother's life was measured in days, perhaps hours. He had seen the slow decay, the wasting of flesh, the king who once sat the Iron Throne with a steady hand, now barely able to rise from his bed. And yet, when the raven came, its black wings cutting through the grey sky over the island fortress, the news still struck like a blade of ice. King Viserys was dead. The raven's message was brief, but it carried the weight of a crown, and it was not the only news. While the king's body had barely grown cold in the Red Keep, a faction of the small council, led by Queen Alicent Hightower and her father Otto, had moved with brutal efficiency. They had crowned Aegon II in the Dragon Pit, not in the Great Sept, not with the full court, but in the ancient domed temple where dragons once roosted. They dressed him in the Conqueror's crown, placed Blackfire in his hand, and declared him king before a gathered crowd of knights and lords who had been carefully chosen for their loyalty. The Greens had stolen the throne in the span of a single night. Daemon read the letter twice, his jaw tightening with each word. He was not a man given to loud outbursts of grief. His rage was a cold thing, a serpent coiled in his chest. He set the parchment down on the carved stone table in the chamber of the painted table, the very room where they had spent long nights planning for this very moment. The plans were no longer theoretical. The war had begun. He walked to Rhaenyra's chambers, without a word, his boots echoing on the stone steps. She was already awake, already dressed in black, her face pale but composed. She had known too. They had both known. But knowing and seeing the crown placed on another's head were different things. Daemon did not offer empty comforts. He told her what the Raven said, his voice flat and hard. Aegon had been proclaimed. The dragon pit had been used as a stage for usurpation. The realm was being torn in two, while Viserys' body still lay in state. And then he said the words that would seal their fate. "We must crown you now, here, before they can spread their lies any further." And so they did. Not in a grand sept, not with the pomp of the Red Keep. They gathered in the ancient hall of Dragonstone, before the carved stone throne of Aegon the Conqueror. The lords and knights who had remained loyal to Rhaenyra stood in heavy silence, torches flickering against the damp walls. The crown of Viserys was placed upon her brow by Daemon's own hands, and he knelt and swore his oath to her, the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, the rightful heir. The Blacks had answered with a roar of steel and dragon fire. In that moment, the realm was sundered. Two kings were crowned. Two queens claimed the same throne. The Greens held King's Landing, the Treasury, the Great Sept, and the allegiance of the Hightowers and their allies. The Blacks held Dragonstone, the loyalty of the North, the Riverlands, the Vale, and the dragons of Daemon, Rhaenyra, and their children. The dance of the dragons had begun not with a single battle, but with a single word spoken in a dark chamber. Daemon wasted no time. He sent ravens to every corner of Westeros, demanding fealty to Queen Rhaenyra. He summoned the lords who had sworn oaths to Viserys to honour their words. He began to prepare Dragonstone for siege, for war, for the inevitable march on the capital. But he knew that the Greens would not wait. They would strike first, likely at Harrenhal, the ancient fortress that controlled the crossroads of the Riverlands. It was the key to any advance south. As the sun set over the narrow sea, Daemon stood on the walls of Dragonstone, watching smoke rise from the distant watchtowers. The Greens had called their first banners. The Blacks would answer. But before the war would bleed across the rivers and fields, there was one place that would become the stage for the first true test of strength, a place where the old ghosts of Harren the Black would bear witness to a new kind of horror. That place would be Harrenhal, and Daemon intended to take it. The Green Usurpation had been set in motion the moment King Viserys drew his last breath, and Daemon Targaryen knew it before the Raven even reached Dragonstone. Rhaenyra's coronation was swift, defiant and necessary, but a queen cannot rule from a single island fortress. She needed allies, she needed resources, and above all, she needed a foothold in the heart of the realm. That foothold would be Harrenhal. Harrenhal was not just a castle, it was a monument to ambition and ruin, the largest fortress in all of Westeros, built by the Ironborn King Harren the Black and cursed by the dragons of Aegon the Conqueror. Its towers were twisted, its halls vast and cold, its stones soaked in centuries of blood and madness. Whoever held Harrenhal held the Riverlands, and whoever held the Riverlands could threaten the capital itself. Daemon understood this better than anyone, and so, in the grey hours after Rhaenyra's crowning, he made a decision that would define the opening moves of the war. He would fly alone. No host of knights, no column of banners. Just Daemon, Dark Sister at his hip and Caraxes, the Blood Wyrm wheeling beneath the clouds. The flight from Dragonstone to Harrenhal is a long one, spanning the Bay of Crabs and the Trident's winding branches. But Caraxes was built for distance, his serpentine body cutting through the air like a crimson blade. Daemon did not race. He soared, letting the cold wind strip away everything but the purpose ahead. He knew that speed was a weapon in itself. Rumour travelled slower than dragon wings, and by the time Harrenhal's garrison saw the shadow swallowing their walls, it would already be too late. He arrived at dusk, when the cursed castle's black spires caught the dying sun like jagged teeth. The garrison was commanded by Sir Simon Strong, an aged and pragmatic Castellan who had served House Strong for decades. He was no fool. When Caraxes descended into the yard, shaking the earth with his landing, Sir Simon did not order a charge. He ordered a parley. Daemon dismounted alone, the Valyrian steel at his side gleaming in the twilight. He walked into the great hall of Harrenhal, a cavernous space where the roof still bore the scorch marks of Balerian's fire, and faced Sir Simon without a single guard at his back. It was a masterful display of confidence, the kind of gambit only a man with nothing to lose and everything to gain would attempt. He offered terms: yield the castle, and every man inside would keep his life and his honour. Refuse and Harrenhal would earn a second Dragonfire scar. Sir Simon Strong surrendered without a fight. There was no blood, no clash of steel, no defiant last stand. The castle that had withstood sieges and treachery fell to a single prince and his dragon in the span of an evening. The Strongs, who had long been loyalists to the Greens, found themselves displaced. Sir Simon was allowed to leave in peace, but Daemon kept the castle's stores, its towers, and its strategic position. Harrenhal was now a black fortress, but Daemon did not simply occupy Harrenhal. He made it his lair, and in doing so, he began a new kind of war. A war whispered in the dark, felt in the chill of corridors that seemed to remember every death they had witnessed. Daemon understood that fear could conquer more than steel. He walked the battlements at night, his silhouette visible against the moon. He let the rumours spread that the rogue prince had made his home in the Tower of Dread, that he communed with the ghosts of Harren and his sons, that he held court in a room where the shadows moved of their own accord. The lords of the Riverlands, already torn between loyalty to the Iron Throne and the memory of old grudges, began to wonder if siding with Aegon was truly the safer path. The psychological warfare Daemon waged from those cursed towers was subtle and relentless. He sent ravens not with demands but with riddles. He released prisoners with accounts of dragon roars echoing beneath the castle at midnight. He allowed spies to escape, carrying tales of a prince who never slept, who spoke to his dragon in High Valyrian while staring into the flames. Harrenhal had always been a place of dark legend, but Daemon weaponized that legend. He made the castle itself an ally, and he waited for word from Rhaenyra, for the war to truly begin, for the first blow that would shatter the fragile peace that still clung to the realm. That blow would come not in the field of battle, but in the shadows of a royal bedchamber. It would be swift, brutal, and deeply personal. A strike designed to break the spirit of the Green Queen and her kin. It would be called Blood and Cheese, and when it was done, no one on either side would ever believe in mercy again. From the towering walls of Harrenhal, Daemon Targaryen had secured a foothold in the heart of the Riverlands. The ancient fortress, cursed and crumbling, now answered to the Queen's banner. But even as the black dragon flew above the towers, a raven arrived from the east, with news that would chill the blood of every Targaryen. Prince Lucerys Velaryon was dead. The death of Lucerys, Rhaenyra's second son, had been no accident of war. It was a murder carried out by Aemon Targaryen and his dragon Vargar, high above Storm's End, in the howling wind and rain. The Greens had taken the first life, and Daemon, seated in the damp hall of Harrenhal, heard the report with a stillness that made the air itself seem to freeze. He did not weep. He did not rage. Instead, he spoke a single sentence, low and deliberate, as if forging it in dragonfire. An eye for an eye, a son for a son. Those words would echo through the ages, a promise written in shadow and steel. But Daemon was not a man to act alone in the dark. He knew the secret places of King's Landing better than any lord. He had walked the gutters of Flea Bottom, shared bread with cut-pursers and murderers, and so he summoned a man from those very depths, a rat-catcher named Cheese, who knew the tunnels beneath the Red Keep like the inside of his own palm. Cheese was a creature of petty cruelty, but Daemon gave him a purpose greater than any he had known. Together with a former city watchman called Blood, a brutal, broken knight who had once served under Daemon's own gold cloaks, the plan was set. They would enter the Red Keep, find the heir of the usurper, and deliver a message that would never be forgotten. The night was moonless, the city asleep. Blood and Cheese slipped through a forgotten postern gate, then down into the labyrinth of sewers and forgotten cellars. They emerged inside Maegor's holdfast, the heart of the castle, where the royal family lay sleeping. They did not come for Aegon the usurper, they came for his children. In the Queen's chambers, Helaena Targaryen lay in bed with her two young children, the twins, Jaehaerys and Jaehaera, and the infant Maelor. Blood and Cheese burst in, blades drawn. Helaena screamed, but the guards were too far, the walls too thick. The assassins demanded to know which child was the eldest son. They had come for Aegon's heir. Helaena, desperate, bewildered, tried to bargain. She offered coin, jewels, anything. But Blood and Cheese had not come for treasure, they had come for blood. In a moment of terrible choice, Helaena pointed to her little boy, Prince Jaehaerys. She thought, perhaps they would take him hostage. She was wrong. Cheese held the boy down, while Blood swung the blade. The prince was not quite 6 years old. His head was severed from his body, a deed so savage that even the hardened killers paused. They left the head on the floor, and as they vanished back into the tunnels, Cheese whispered to the Queen, "Your husband's debt is paid, a son for a son." The murder of Prince Jaehaerys sent shockwaves through the Seven Kingdoms. It was the first time the Dance of the Dragons had touched the children of the royal house. The Greens howled for vengeance. The Blacks, even those loyal to Rhaenyra, felt a cold dread. For all his charm and courage, Daemon Targaryen had now stained his legacy with the blood of an innocent boy. He had not done the deed himself, but he had ordered it. He had chosen the method, the words, the message, and that message was clear. There would be no mercy, no quarter, no childish distinction between soldier and babe. War had entered the nursery, and yet, as the ravens flew and the realm recoiled, Daemon sat in Harrenhal, carving a notch in the stone windowsill with Dark Sister. He did not mourn, he did not justify, he simply waited for the next move, for the next battle, for the next son or daughter to fall. The prince, who had once been called the Rogue, now wore the name of Butcher, and the war was only beginning. In the coming days, the Blacks would gather their strength, and Daemon would become the master of their armies, the dark architect of a campaign that would burn the realm to ash. But before that, he had one more lesson to teach. The master of the Blacks was about to write his name in fire. The blood had barely dried on the floors of the Red Keep when the whispers began. An eye for an eye, a son for a son. Daemon had spoken those words with the cold certainty of a man who had long since abandoned any pretense of mercy, and the realm heard them. But what followed that dreadful night was not the end of the war, nor even its darkest hour. It was the moment when the Blacks transformed from a court in mourning into a war machine, and at its centre stood the Rogue Prince, now acting as the true commander of Rhaenyra's cause. In the weeks after Blood and Cheese, Daemon did not linger at Harrenhal to brood. He became a ghost in the skies, a red shadow moving from castle to castle, from Dragonstone to Dragonstone. Caraxes carried him from Dragonstone to the Eyrie, from the Eyrie to White Harbour, and from White Harbour to the Riverlands. He was not merely a prince anymore, he was a quartermaster, a general, a spymaster, and a dragon lord all at once. And his first great task was the coordination of the Black Dragon Riders. Rhaenyra's faction possessed more dragons than the Greens, but that advantage meant nothing without discipline. Every dragon rider was a weapon of mass destruction, but they were also human, with their own fears, ambitions, and rivalries. Daemon understood this better than anyone. He had spent his entire life on Dragonback, and he knew that a dragon without a clear order was as dangerous to its own side as to the enemy. So he devised a system. He divided the black dragons into squadrons, each with a specific purpose. The largest and most fearsome beasts, like Vargar on the green side, would be matched by the swiftest and most aggressive riders on the black side. But Daemon's true stroke of genius was the naval blockade. He understood that the Greens held King's Landing, but they could not hold it forever if the city starved. The Black Fleet, commanded by Lord Corlys Velaryon, controlled the Gullet, the narrow sea that fed the capital. Daemon ordered the Sea Snake to tighten the noose, to prevent any ship from reaching the Red Keep with food or reinforcements. From his command post at Harrenhal, Daemon sent ravens to every loyal lord in the realm, instructing them to harry green supply lines, to burn their crops, to blockade their ports. The war was no longer a series of dramatic battles. It was a grinding siege, a war of attrition that would bleed the Greens dry, and Daemon was the architect of that slow, deliberate ruin. But even as he orchestrated this grand strategy from afar, the Black Council in Dragonstone was fracturing. Rhaenyra had become queen in all but the official coronation, but the crown weighed heavily upon her. The death of her son Lucerys had shattered something inside her. She had always been proud, fierce and stubborn, but now she was also paranoid. She saw traitors everywhere. She questioned the loyalty of every lord, every knight, even her own handmaidens. The council meetings grew tense. Lord Corlys, the Sea Snake, counselled patience and a long war. He had fought the Triarchy for years. He understood that victory came not from one great stroke, but from 1,000 small cuts. But others, like the hot-headed young princes and the newly arrived lords from the Reach, demanded immediate action. They wanted to fly to King's Landing, to burn the Red Keep to ash, to end the war in a single night of fire and blood. Rhaenyra listened to all of them, but her eyes often drifted to the empty seat where her son had once sat. She could not bear to lose another child. She could not bear to trust anyone fully. And in that atmosphere of suspicion, Daemon's distance became a problem. Some whispered that he was too independent, that he was building his own power base at Harrenhal, that he might one day challenge her for the throne. Others, like the ever-loyal but ever-scheming Mysaria, fed these rumours with carefully chosen words. Daemon, however, was not plotting against Rhaenyra. He was plotting against Daemon Targaryen, the one-eyed prince who had murdered Lucerys. The hunt for Aemond had become an obsession, a fire that burned hotter than any dragon flame. But he knew he could not simply charge into the Riverlands with Caraxes and challenge Vargar to a duel. That would be madness. Vhagar was the largest dragon in the world, and even Caraxes, fierce as he was, could not match her raw power. No, the hunt required cunning, not just courage. And so Daemon conceived a trap. King's Landing was the Green Heart, the seat of Aegon the Usurper, but holding it was a burden. The city was vast, hungry and restless. Every day the blockade tightened, the people grew more desperate. The Greens had to break the siege, or they would starve, and to break the siege, they would have to commit their dragons to battle. Daemon proposed to Rhaenyra and the Black Council a radical plan. Abandon King's Landing, let the Greens think they had won a victory, withdraw the fleet, open the blockade, and let the enemy believe the Blacks were in retreat. But in truth, the withdrawal would be a feint. The moment the Greens sent their dragons out of the city to secure supply lines or pursue the fleeing Black forces, Daemon would strike. He would isolate Aemond, corner him, and end the war with a single decisive blow. Rhaenyra hesitated. Abandoning King's Landing felt like surrender, like admitting defeat. But Daemon argued with a fervour she had not seen in years. He spoke of the long game, of the art of war, of the need to sacrifice ground to gain the ultimate victory. He reminded her that she had named him Protector of the Realm, and that he would not fail her. In the end, she agreed. The order went out. The Black forces would withdraw from the capital, melting back into the Riverlands and the Crownlands. The blockade would be lifted, and the Greens would taste a brief, desperate hope. And then, when they least expected it, the trap would spring. But even as Daemon prepared for the hunt, the tensions within the Black Council boiled over. Lord Corlys, who had spent his fortune and his family for Rhaenyra's cause, grew weary of the constant suspicion. He demanded an accounting of the treasury, the war plans, of every decision. Rhaenyra, in turn, accused him of questioning her authority. The argument grew so heated that the sea snake stormed out of the council chamber, vowing to serve the queen from his ships, where at least the salt spray kept men honest. And in that moment of fracture, Daemon saw the danger. The Blacks were winning the war, but losing the peace. If they could not hold together, if Rhaenyra's paranoia devoured the loyalty of her own allies, then all the dragons in the world would not save them. He sent a raven to Dragonstone, a private message meant for the Queen's eyes alone. In it he spoke not as a commander, but as a husband. He reminded her of their children, of the future they were fighting for, of the love that had bound them together in the fire of the Stepstones and the quiet of the Dragonstone chambers. He told her to trust the sea snake, to trust her counsel, and above all, to trust him. Whether that message reached her heart or not, the war moved on. The withdrawal from King's Landing began, slow and deliberate, like a tide receding before a storm. And somewhere in the Riverlands, Daemon Targaryen, the one-eyed prince, rode Vargar through the smoke of burning villages, searching for a battle that would prove his worth. He did not know that he was also being hunted. He did not know that the master of the Blacks had set his sights on him, and that Caraxes was already tasting the fire of the hunt to come. The war was about to change. The next blow would be struck, not in the halls of power, but in the wild skies above the Godswood and the river, and the name of that strike would echo through history as the hunt for the one-eyed prince. The previous chapter left us in the midst of the Black Council's growing fractures, Rhaenyra's paranoia tightening like a noose around those she once trusted, and Daemon standing apart, already a ghost in her court. While she worried about spies and betrayal among her own ranks, Daemon's mind was fixed on something far more singular, a hunt, not for territory, not for gold, not for any strategic advantage that could be measured in castles or coin. He was hunting a one-eyed ghost named Daemon Targaryen, and the obsession had already begun to consume him. From the moment Prince Lucerys Velaryon fell from the sky above Storm's End, torn apart by Aemond and his dragon Vhagar, Daemon's grief had crystallized into a single burning purpose. He would see Aemond dead, not in battle, not as a casualty of war, but personally, deliberately, with his own hands if possible. Blood and cheese had been a message, a grim echo of the debt owed, but it had not satisfied the deeper hunger. Revenge demanded the principal debtor, not a substitute, and so Daemon set himself to the task of drawing Aemond out, or cornering him in the one place where the boy prince might feel bold enough to strike. That place was Harrenhal. The cursed, half-ruined fortress on the shores of the God's Eye had become Daemon's lair. He had taken it without a fight, its crumbling towers and blackened stones offering little resistance. But the real purpose of his occupation was not to hold the castle. It was to wait. He believed, perhaps rightly, that Aemond, having bloodied his fangs with Lucerys's death and now commanding the largest dragon in the world, would eventually come challenge the man who had humiliated his family for years. Daemon knew his nephew's pride. He knew the rage that simmered behind that sapphire eye, and so he waited. But waiting is a cruel kind of war, especially for a man like Daemon Targaryen, who had never been patient by nature. The days stretched into weeks, the weeks into months. He roamed the halls of Harrenhal, its stones still weeping from the dragonfire of a century past, and he found no peace there. The castle was said to be haunted, and perhaps it was, but Daemon began to see things in the flickering torchlight. Shadows that moved without source, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Some said the ghosts of Harren the Black and his sons still walked there, cursed to relive their fiery doom. But Daemon's ghosts were more intimate. He saw the faces of his daughters, left behind on Dragonstone, He saw Laena, his lost wife, and the phantom of a life that might have been. And he saw Lucerys the boy, with the soft heart and the quick smile, tumbling into the dark waters of Shipbreaker Bay. The loneliness of that vigil was profound. Harrenhal was no place for company. Its great hall could swallow 100 men and still feel empty, and Daemon had only a handful of trusted retainers with him. Among them was a young woman named Nettles, a dragon rider of mysterious origin who had claimed the wild dragon sheep stealer. She had come to Harrenhal as part of Daemon's broader effort to gather as many dragon riders as possible. But what grew between them was something far more complicated than a military alliance. Nettles was fierce, unpolished, and utterly unafraid of Daemon, qualities that drew him to her like a moth to flame. She reminded him, perhaps, of a younger, freer version of himself, or of the women he had loved, who had burned too brightly and too briefly. Their relationship is one of the great mysteries of the Dance of the Dragons. Some maesters suggest she became his lover, a comfort in the cold nights at Harrenhal. Others argue it was a bond of loyalty, nothing more, a fatherly mentorship perhaps, or the companionship of two outcasts who understood each other without words. What is certain is that Daemon trusted her. He taught her, trained with her, and confided in her as he confided in almost no one else. And that trust would become a problem, because Rhaenyra, far away on Dragonstone and growing ever more suspicious, began to hear whispers of the closeness between her husband and this ragged girl. Those whispers were poison. Rhaenyra's paranoia, already fed by betrayals real and imagined, latched onto Nettles like a disease. She saw a rival, a threat, a woman who might steal Daemon's loyalty just when she needed it most. And so from the Queen's court an order came: seize Nettles or put her to death. Daemon received the command at Harrenhal, and he understood immediately what it meant. Rhaenyra had crossed a line from fear into madness. She was demanding the blood of an innocent, and he would not obey. The parting came on a grey morning beside the God's Eye. Daemon gave Nettles his own provisions, his own map, and told her to flee. He could not protect her from the Queen's reach, not while the war demanded he stay. But he could give her a chance. She mounted Sheepstealer, the wild dragon that had chosen her, and took to the sky without looking back. Daemon watched until she became a speck against the clouds, and then he turned to face Harrenhal again, more alone than ever. Whether he loved her or not, he had chosen to let her go, and that choice carved another hollow in his chest. Now the hunt was all that remained. Aemond had not come to Harrenhal yet, but Daemon knew he would. The one-eyed prince was out there, rampaging through the riverlands, burning and looting and daring Daemon to face him. Every report of ruined villages and charred fields was a taunt. A piece of bait dangled before the rogue prince, and Daemon, though he waited, was not idle. He sharpened Dark Sister each night, the Valyrian steel glinting in the firelight. He studied the shores of the God's Eye, the same lake that gave Harrenhal its name, and he began to plan a meeting that could only end one way. The hours grew longer, the nights darker. Daemon spoke less and less to the few men who remained with him, retreating into a silence that was almost predatory. He knew, with the certainty of a man who has seen too much to be fooled, that the final confrontation was approaching. Aemond would come, Vargar would come, and when they did, Daemon would be ready to meet them, not as a general commanding armies, but as a single rider on a red dragon, carrying an ancient sword and a heart full of vengeance. That moment would come soon. The lake still gleamed under the moon, and the winds whispered through the broken towers of Harrenhal, carrying the distant cries of war. But for now, Daemon waited, a lonely king of a cursed castle, counting the days until the one-eyed prince finally answered his call. The stage was set for a duel that would be remembered for centuries. A battle not for thrones or crowns, but for the raw primal satisfaction of a blood debt finally paid. And when the sky above the God's Eye turned black with dragon wings, no one who witnessed it would ever forget the name of that encounter. He had been waiting for this moment for weeks. The message had come from Harrenhal's ravens. Rumours of a one-eyed prince flying patrols over the riverlands at dusk, daring the rogue to emerge. Daemon Targaryen knew his nephew Aemond would not stay hidden forever. The Dance of Dragons demanded its final duet, and the stage was already set above the black waters of the God's Eye. For nights Daemon had stood alone on the battlements of Harrenhal's haunted tower, the cold wind carrying the distant roar of Vargar. He could feel the old she-dragon's presence like a shadow over the land, and he knew that Aemond too was hunting. The war had become personal the moment Lucerys died, an eye for an eye, a son for a son. But that was only the beginning. Aemond had taken more than an eye. He had taken the future of House Targaryen by killing a child. Daemon would not let that stand. On the day of the battle, a low fog clung to the surface of the lake, and the sun hung pale behind a layer of ash and smoke from distant fires. Daemon had no army with him, only Caxes. The Blood Wyrm coiled beneath him, scales glistening like wet ruby, restless and eager. Daemon whispered to him in High Valyrian, a language of fire and pact, and Caraxes answered with a hiss that trembled through the stones of Harrenhal. Then they launched. The flight to the God's Eye was short. Daemon had chosen the lake for a reason. No ground forces, no interference, just dragon against dragon, rider against rider. It was a dueling ground worthy of legend, a place where the only witnesses would be the fish below and the gods above. As Caraxes beat his great wings across the water, Daemon spotted Vargar, massive and dark as a thundercloud, circling low over the lake's northern shore. Aemond had seen him too. There was no hesitation. The two dragons met above the centre of the lake with a crash that split the air. Caraxes was smaller and faster, his serpentine neck twisting to avoid Vargar's first snap. But Vargar was ancient, bloated with centuries of war, and her jaws could crush a horse in a single bite. She lunged, and Caraxes twisted aside, his claws raking along Vargar's flank, tearing through scales and drawing black blood that rained into the water below. Aemond did not flinch. He threw himself against his saddle and urged Vargar higher, trying to gain the altitude advantage. But Daemon had fought in the Stepstones, had flown in the tight confines of Skargos, and through the storms of the Shivering Sea. He knew the tricks of dragon combat. He let Vargar climb, let Aemond think he was winning, and then he turned Caraxes in a tight spiral, climbing beneath the old dragon's belly. The two beasts collided again, necks locked, wings beating against each other, sending great gusts across the lake that stirred the fog into spiralling columns of mist. Below, the water churned. Aemond shouted something, perhaps a taunt, perhaps a curse. Daemon did not hear it. He was focused on the gap between the two dragons. Vhagar's belly was exposed for just a moment, and Caraxes struck, sinking his fangs into her shoulder. Vhagar roared, a sound that echoed for miles, and her tail whipped around, slamming into Caraxes' side. The Blood Wyrm shuddered but held on, and both dragons began to fall, locked together, spinning toward the water. This was the moment Daemon had been waiting for. He was not a young man anymore, but he was still the most dangerous swordsman in Westeros, and he carried Dark Sister, the blade of Queen Visenya, forged in the fires of Valyria. He knew that if he stayed in the saddle, Caraxes and Vargar would crash into the lake together, and the impact might kill him as surely as it would kill Aemond. But Daemon had never been one to accept shared fates. He wanted Aemond's death to be his own doing, not the result of a dragon's fall. As the two dragons descended, Caraxes and Vhagar snapping and bleeding, Daemon unfastened his safety chain. He rose in his stirrups, balancing on the edge of the saddle, and then he leaped. It was not a jump of desperation. It was a calculated, deliberate act of fury. He flew through the air, Dark Sister extended, and he landed on Vhagar's back, slamming into Aemond with such force that the prince's hands slipped from the reins. Aemond turned, his single eye wide with shock. He had not expected Daemon to abandon his own dragon. In that frozen second, Daemon saw everything he needed. The sapphire that Aemond had fitted into his empty socket, the thin chainmail coif beneath his helm, the fear that flickered behind the hatred. Daemon raised Dark Sister. The blade entered through the eye socket, sliding between bone and nerve, driving deep into the brain. Aemon did not have time to scream. His body went rigid, then slack, and Daemon pulled the sword free, balanced on the back of a dying Varga as the world spun toward the lake. The fall was inevitable. Caraxes, still locked in combat, had latched onto Varga's throat, and the two dragons, intertwined and bleeding, struck the surface of the God's Eye. The impact was catastrophic. A pillar of water rose higher than any tower of Harrenhal, and the shockwave sent ripples across the entire lake. Daemon was thrown clear, his limbs flailing in the darkness, the cold water closing over him. He saw Caraxes, still thrashing, pulling Varga deeper into the depths. He saw the silhouette of Aemon's body, still strapped to his saddle, sinking into the blackness. And then Daemon felt the currents pulling him down, the weight of armor, the relentless drag of the abyss. He did not resurface, not as a living man. For days, the waters of the God's Eye remained disturbed. Fishermen reported seeing strange lights beneath the surface, and the King's Guards sent search parties to find Daemon's body. They found nothing, no trace of the rogue prince, no sign of Dark Sister, no evidence that he had ever existed except for the tales that would grow into legend. But the battle above the God's Eye was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a mystery that would haunt the histories of Westeros for generations. The question remained, whispered in the halls of the Red Keep and in the low-lit taverns of the Riverlands. Where did Daemon Targaryen truly go? What happened to the man who leaped into the void with a dragon's scream and a sword of Valyrian steel? The next chapter will explore that question thoroughly. The mystery of the body that was never found, the rumours of a haunted lake, and the truth that lies buried in the silence beneath the waves. But for now, we leave Daemon in the depths, his legend forged in fire and water, eternal as the dragons he once commanded. And so, Daemon Targaryen and Aemond One-Eye plunged into the dark waters of the God's Eye, locked in a final, fatal embrace. Caraxes and Varga, the two greatest dragons of the dance, had torn each other apart in the sky above, their bodies crashing into the lake in a cataclysm of steam and blood. For the witnesses who had gathered along the shores, soldiers, shepherds, and small folk who had seen the duel from afar, there was nothing left to see but the ripples slowly dying on the surface. The lake swallowed everything whole. For years, that was the story. The lake kept its secrets, and in the chaos of the war that followed, with the Green scrambling to hold King's Landing, and the Black straining to secure their victory, there was no time to dredge the depths of the God's Eye. Aemond was presumed dead. Daemon was presumed dead. But in a war built on symbols, the absence of bodies was a dangerous thing. It was not until the war was over, truly over, with Rhaenyra dead and her sons scattered, and a boy king crowned in the ashes, that the recovery efforts finally began. And even then, it was not a matter of honour or sentiment. It was a matter of certainty. The realm needed to know that the one-eyed prince was gone, that Vhagar would never rise again. So in the first year of peace, King Aegon, the Third's regents, ordered a thorough search of the God's Eye. The lake is vast, its waters dark and cold, and the task took months. Local fishermen were conscripted, dragging chains across the bottom, and when they found the first wreckage, it was unmistakable. Vhagar's carcass lay half buried in the silt, her immense rib cage rising like the hull of a sunken ship. She was so large that her tail had to be cut into pieces, just to haul her remains to the surface. Beside her, tangled in her own broken bones, lay Caraxes, his long serpentine neck twisted at an unnatural angle. The Blood Wyrm, who had terrorized the Stepstones and the skies of Westeros, was finally still, but it was what they found inside Vargar's saddle that made the world stop. Aemon's body was still there, strapped into his seat, his fused hand still gripping the reins, and in his empty eye socket, buried deep into the bone, was Dark Sister. The Valyrian steel blade had been driven so hard that it had pierced through his skull and lodged in the back of the saddle. Daemon's aim, his leap from Caraxes, had been true. The sword was still embedded, its edge unmarred by the years under water. When they pulled it free, The blade shone as if it had just been forged. So Aemond was found. He was brought back to King's Landing, given a funeral, a small one, for a prince who had burned the Riverlands and lost the war. Dark Sister was recovered and returned to the Targaryen treasury, waiting for a hand worthy of its legend. But Daemon was nowhere. They searched the area around Vargar and Caraxes for weeks. Divers descended into the murky depths. They found the shattered remains of Dragonbone, pieces of saddle leather, a torn cloak that might have been black or might have been blue, but no body, no sign of the rogue prince. It was as if he had vanished into the water itself. Now, there are those who say the lake simply swallowed him, that his corpse drifted into a deeper trench and was never recovered. The currents in the God's Eye are strong and unpredictable. It is possible that there is another story, one that the Maesters dismiss as peasant fancy, and the Smallfoot whisper with a strange sort of hope. They say Daemon Targaryen did not die that day. Think about it. His sword was found buried in Aemon's eye, proof that he landed the blow, that leap from Caraxes back in the final moments of the duel. What if he did not fall into the water with Aemond? What if he had planned it all along? What if he had practiced that jump 100 times in his mind, knowing that Caraxes would not survive the clash, and that his only chance was to exit his dragon before the impact? The witnesses on the shore saw 2 dragons and 2 men fall, but in the chaos of the fall, who could say which body hit the water first? And if Daemon had managed to separate from Aemond mid-air, his armour stripped away, swimming to a hidden cove under the cover of the smoke and steam, there are legends that Daemon lived, that he made his way to Essos, to the Free Cities, where he took a new name and lived out his days in anonymity, that he watched from afar as his sons Aegon and Viserys eventually claimed the Iron Throne, that he returned to Dragonstone in his old age, alone to die where his story began. There are tavern songs that speak of a hooded man in Braavos who could speak High Valyrian with a northern accent, who paid for his drinks with gold dragons stamped with the face of a king he despised. But there is no proof, no grave, no written confession, no witness who could verify the story. And that is exactly how Daemon would have wanted it. The rogue prince was never one to be pinned down. In life, he slipped through the hands of kings, the grasp of duty, the bounds of marriage and law. He was a ghost long before he died, and in death, he refused to be found because being found would mean being understood. And Daemon was not interested in being understood. He wanted to be a legend, and a legend cannot be buried in a tomb with a name and a date. A legend must remain unfinished. It must leave room for the story to grow. So the Maesters closed the case. They wrote in their histories that Prince Daemon Targaryen died in the battle above the gods, in the year 130 after the conquest. They noted that his body was never recovered. They called him the Rogue Prince. And that was the end of his mortal record. But the story does not end there, because while Daemon's body may be lost, his legacy was only just beginning to take shape. The war he fought, the children he fathered, the throne he helped secure, all of it was about to converge in a final silent victory that would change the course of the Targaryen dynasty forever. That is a tale for another night, a tale of how a dead prince's bloodline claimed the Iron Throne and held it for generations. The name of that chapter is The Posthumous Victory, and when you hear it, you will understand why Daemon Targaryen's greatest triumph was not in the air above the God's Eye, but in the long years after he had fallen into the dark water. The mystery of Daemon Targaryen's body has never been solved. Some say he vanished into the waters of the God's Eye, that his bones rest somewhere beneath the black soil of the lake bed. Others whisper that he survived, that the rogue prince escaped his fate and lived out his years in the shadows of Essos. But whatever the truth of that final plunge, one thing is certain. Daemon Targaryen's story did not end in the year 130 after the conquest. In a way, it was only beginning. The war they called the Dance of the Dragons had consumed everything. Aemond was dead, Varga was dead, Caraxes was dead, and Daemon was gone. But the conflict itself did not end with that battle. Rhaenyra still sat the Iron Throne, though it had never felt more unstable beneath her. The Greens still held King's Landing in all but name, and Aegon the Usurper, though grievously wounded, was still breathing. The war dragged on through fire and famine, through betrayals and bloodbaths, and then, in the chaos that followed the storming of the Dragon Pit, Rhaenyra herself fell. She was fed to Sunfire, the dragon of her half-brother, and the realm saw the first queen to sit the Iron Throne die in agony. For a brief, terrible moment, it seemed the Green faction had won. Aegon II sat the throne once more, scarred and broken, his reign a hollow victory built on the ashes of his family. But the war was not finished. The North had not forgotten its oaths, and the Riverlands were still crawling with black loyalists. And more importantly, Rhaenyra had left behind heirs. Her sons by Daemon, the princes Aegon the Younger and Viserys, were scattered. Aegon had been captured by the Greens and forced to witness horrors no child should see. Viserys had been lost at sea, believed dead, smuggled away to Pentos by loyalists who could not protect him. The line of the rogue prince seemed broken, scattered to the winds. But the tide was about to turn. When Aegon II died, poisoned, some say, by his own council, the throne passed to the only male Targaryen left who could claim it. Aegon the Younger, the son of Daemon and Rhaenyra. He was a boy of 11, a prince who had seen his mother devoured by a dragon, who had been paraded through the streets as a hostage, who had watched the world burn around him. He was crowned Aegon III, and his reign began under a shadow of trauma and loss. But he was a dragon's son, and the blood of the rogue prince ran through his veins. The boy king's early years were a time of regency, of councils and factions jostling for power. But the most remarkable turn came years later, when the Prince Viserys, long thought dead, returned from the Free Cities. He had been ransomed, hidden, and finally made his way back to Westeros. And when he did, he became the hand and the heart of his brother's reign. Viserys II, the younger son of Daemon and Rhaenyra, would go on to rule as Hand and later as king in his own right, a wise and capable ruler who restored order and prosperity to a broken realm. So it was that Daemon Targaryen, the rogue prince, the Lord of Flea Bottom, the king who bore the sword, achieved a victory he never lived to see. His sons, his blood, sat the Iron Throne. Aegon III reigned for 26 years, and Viserys II followed him. Their children, their grandchildren, every Targaryen king from that point forward carried the blood of Daemon and Rhaenyra. The line of the rogue prince became the future of the dynasty. Think about what that means. Daemon had been called a threat, a traitor, a reckless firebrand. He had been exiled, mocked and dismissed. He had died in a desperate gamble, leaping from his saddle to drive a blade through his nephew's eye. And yet in the end, it was his sons who wore the crown. It was his legacy that defined the Targaryen dynasty for generations. The rogue prince had always been a creature of contradictions. He could be cruel and kind in the same breath. He loved deeply and destroyed fiercely. He mingled with whores and kings, and he never quite fit into the world he was born into. But he understood one thing better than anyone else, that thrones are won not by virtue, but by will, and he had will enough to carry his bloodline through the storm. So when we look back at the life of Daemon Targaryen, a man who lived in fire and blood, who courted chaos and danced with dragons, he was not a perfect king, not even a good one by many measures, but he was never meant to be good. He was meant to be remembered. And in the long, winding history of Westeros, his name endures as the spark that lit the flame of a new dynasty. The battle above the God's Eye may have been his end, but it was also his beginning. The rogue prince had finally found his place, not on any throne, but in the blood of his sons, in the lives of every Targaryen who came after. And that, perhaps, is the truest victory of all. What did you think of this journey? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this changed your perspective or taught you something new, consider subscribing for more mind-expanding content. And if you know someone who would find this as fascinating as you did, share it with them.
These are the kind of conversations that matter.